It was a regular Tuesday morning when the world's richest man posted a message that would change everything. Elon Musk, the tech billionaire and SpaceX founder, had just fired off a tweet, a simple, enigmatic sentence that would send shockwaves around the globe. Jesus was black, and I have proof. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Within minutes, the post went viral, trending across every platform imaginable. His followers, many of whom had long idolized Musk for his groundbreaking work in technology and space exploration, were left in utter disbelief. What was this? Another one of his eccentric stunts, like the infamous Tesla stock price is too high tweet? Or had Musk, once a man known for building the future, just cracked open a secret buried in the past? Is this some kind of joke? One Twitter user commented, "What the hell is Musk talking about?" Another replied, "No way. He's lost it." But Musk, ever the enigmatic figure, didn't offer much more explanation. Instead, his tweet simply linked to a new video on his personal YouTube channel titled, "Proof: The True Identity of Jesus Christ." And with that, the world held its breath. For the next several hours, social media erupted with a mix of confusion, anger, and curiosity. Some people scoffed, claiming Musk had gone off the deep end, while others, those with more open minds, began to ask themselves, what if? What if Musk had stumbled upon something monumental? Something that could shift the way humanity viewed religion, history, and race? By the time the video hit, millions had already speculated on the contents. But what they weren't prepared for was the profound shock that Musk was about to drop on them. The video began innocuously enough. It opened with Musk seated in front of a bookshelf, a slight smile playing at his lips. His usual demeanor of cool, calculated confidence was replaced with something different, a quiet intensity. "Hey everyone, I know you're probably thinking I'm crazy right now," Musk started, his voice calm yet laden with a strange sense of urgency. "But I've spent the last few months working with a team of historians, archaeologists, and theologians. We've uncovered something that could rewrite the history books. The truth about Jesus Christ, his race, his heritage, has been hidden from the world for centuries, and I have the proof." He leaned forward, the weight of his words settling into the viewer's mind. "For years, we've been shown a version of Jesus that doesn't match the evidence. The idea that Jesus was white, a European, has been perpetuated by centuries of religious and political influence. But we've discovered new manuscripts, DNA evidence, and historical records that suggest something else entirely." The screen flashed briefly, then faded to a black and white image of ancient scrolls. Musk's voice continued to narrate over the footage. "Here's where it gets interesting. The evidence we've found points to a completely different portrait of Jesus, a man with African roots, who lived in the Middle East but was part of a community with deep ties to Africa." The video abruptly cut to a map, zooming in on key historical sites. The music turned darker, building suspense as Musk detailed their findings in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Israel. Hidden libraries, forgotten artifacts, and the rediscovery of long-lost religious texts. In each instance, they found references that contradicted the traditional narrative of Jesus being a pale-skinned, blue-eyed figure. Instead, every piece of evidence painted a very different picture. Jesus was likely a black man. Musk spoke again, and it's not just about race. It's about the power structures that have kept this truth from the public. Why was this hidden? Why did history paint Jesus as someone he was not? The video ended with a provocative question. What does this change for our understanding of religion, history, and race? The reactions were immediate and intense. Thousands of people scrambled to download the video, share it, and comment on it. News outlets began to report on the controversy. Speculation about Musk's motivations ran rampant. Was this a stunt? A miscalculation? Or was it, as some argued, an attempt to start a conversation about racial identity and religion? Did he just say Jesus was black? This tweet was the first of many that began trending worldwide. A flood of articles followed, dissecting Musk's claim. Religious leaders, historians, and cultural critics weighed in. Most rejected Musk's statement outright, calling it heretical or blasphemous. while others saw it as a chance to explore questions about the historical Jesus that had never been fully addressed. But perhaps the most intriguing reaction came from ordinary people, those who had grown up in Christian households, who had been raised on images of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus, who felt their worldview unraveling with every passing second. Could it be true? Was the Jesus they'd been taught about for generations nothing more than a constructed image? And amidst all the chatter, one question lingered above the rest. Why now? Why had Musk, of all people, decided to take on the biggest question in human history? Before anyone could fully process the gravity of Musk's claim, another tweet popped up on his timeline. This one was short and cryptic. The truth is stranger than fiction. Stay tuned. More coming soon. And just like that, the world was on edge. The billionaire tech mogul had not only shocked the world, but he had ignited a firestorm of debate that would stretch across continents, religions, and political ideologies. What Musk had started was no longer just a question about the race of Jesus. It had become a question about the very nature of truth, history, and faith. Could something as sacred as religion be rewritten? And if so, by whom? The next chapter of this strange, high-stakes journey had begun. And for those brave enough to face the unknown, it would change everything they thought they knew about the world. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The world was about to find out. Elon Musk was never supposed to be a household name. Born in Pretoria, South Africa, in 1971, he came into the world under circumstances that seemed far from the path to becoming one of the most influential people in modern history. His father, Elon Musk, was an affluent engineer, and his mother, May Musk, a model and dietitian, was the one who would later call him a dreamer, often pushing him to pursue big ideas that seemed far-fetched. From an early age, Elon was known to be a curious, sometimes solitary child. He was the sort of kid who would get lost in a book, devouring everything from Lord of the Rings to the technical manuals for computers. His love for technology was apparent even before his teens, when he taught himself how to program and created a video game called Blaster at just 12 years old. But his genius was often misunderstood by others, particularly his classmates. He was bullied relentlessly in school, and the isolation only deepened as he grew older. Elon's childhood experiences formed the bedrock of his later ambitions. His desire to explore, to push boundaries, and to shatter what others thought was possible. But those same experiences also forged the quiet resilience that would later define his career. There was always something about him that was untouchable, a kind of unshakable confidence, though many people close to him would later describe his inner world as something far more complex, full of uncertainty, self-doubt, and a need for validation that he rarely acknowledged. By the time he left for Canada and then the United States to attend Queen's University and later the University of Pennsylvania, Elon had already developed an obsession with changing the world. While others his age were partying or worrying about their next class, Musk was reading about physics, technology, and energy. He wasn't just looking for a career. He was looking for a mission, one that could fundamentally alter the course of humanity. It wasn't until the late 1990s, when he dropped out of Stanford after just 2 days of graduate school, that the real transformation began. Most people would have seen it as a reckless decision. But for Elon, it was the beginning of his lifelong quest to do something that mattered. His first startup, Zip2, was sold to Compaq for nearly $300 million in 1999. A few years later, he went on to found X.com, an online payments company that would eventually become PayPal. By the time eBay bought PayPal for $1.5 billion in 2002, Musk was already wealthy beyond what most people could dream. But it was never about the money for Elon. It was always about the possibilities that wealth could unlock. With that newfound capital, he set his sights on ventures far beyond the ordinary. SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, The Boring Company, all of them were part of his vision to reshape not just the future of technology but the very future of humanity. He wasn't just interested in electric cars or private space travel. He wanted to solve humanity's biggest existential problems: climate change, resource depletion, and the future of consciousness itself. But there was one thing that had always intrigued him, something that was strangely personal: the nature of belief, truth, and the stories we tell ourselves. In many ways, Musk's ventures had always operated at the intersection of science, philosophy, and the imagination. He didn't just want to make better rockets or cars. He wanted to change the way we thought about everything, from the potential of artificial intelligence to the nature of human existence. Throughout his life, Musk had been drawn to the mysteries of the universe. The more he learned about space, the more questions it raised. He was fascinated by the great questions of human history. Where did we come from? What is our purpose? And somewhere, deep within his mind, there was an unspoken question that he had never fully explored. What is the true nature of God? It wasn't that Musk was particularly religious. Far from it. His beliefs were often described as agnostic, with a philosophical lean towards the scientific. Yet there was something about the concept of religion that he couldn't shake off, a constant pull to understand the narratives that had shaped billions of people's lives for centuries. As much as he sought rational, logical explanations for the world around him, he also recognized that there were gaps in human knowledge, places where science couldn't reach. And it was in those gaps that he began to question what was hidden from view. Musk had already made waves in the tech world, revolutionizing industries from electric vehicles to space exploration. But now, with this latest revelation, Jesus was black. He seemed to be stepping into a new realm, the realm of cultural, historical, and theological exploration. Why, after all this time, did he feel the need to challenge something so sacred? What had driven him to make such a bold, controversial statement? The answer, perhaps, lay in the way Musk had always approached the world, by questioning everything. For someone who had upended industries and transformed society with bold, unconventional ideas, a statement like this wasn't about personal gain or notoriety. No, it was part of something bigger. Musk didn't believe in doing things halfway. When he decided to tackle a problem, he went all in. And uncovering the truth about Jesus wasn't just a side project or a publicity stunt. It was, in his mind, a matter of global importance. It was a challenge to centuries of ingrained beliefs, a chance to disrupt the way people thought about faith, race, and identity. He knew that the consequences of such a claim could be monumental, even dangerous. But that, in a way, made the quest even more thrilling for Musk. Because if he was right, if Jesus truly had been a black man, and the truth had been hidden for centuries, then the ripple effects would change the world forever. And as he sat in his office, watching the online frenzy explode in real time, he couldn't help but think, this is just the beginning. As the world reacted to Musk's bold claim, the debate shifted into high gear. News outlets, religious leaders, and cultural commentators quickly took their positions, some denouncing him outright, others cautiously considering the possibility. But one thing was clear. Elon Musk had ignited a global firestorm. What had started as a single tweet had evolved into something far more complex and far-reaching. The world was now divided. For Musk, the responses were both exhilarating and exhausting. On the one hand, the flood of attention was exactly what he had expected, a mix of anger, curiosity, and disbelief. On the other, it was more than he had bargained for. The stakes were higher than he ever anticipated. This wasn't just about one controversial statement. It was about religion, race, and history, three subjects that, when intertwined, could lead to untold chaos. But Musk had never shied away from controversy. If anything, he thrived in it. He'd faced fierce opposition throughout his career, from doubters in the tech industry who said Tesla would never succeed to critics who believed SpaceX would fail. But in every instance, he'd proven them wrong by sticking to his guns and pushing forward with unrelenting determination. This was no different. What worried him more was the backlash from the religious community. Evangelical pastors, Catholic scholars, and prominent theologians were all quickly mobilizing against him. Their argument was clear. Musk's claim was not only false, but sacrilegious. Jesus Christ, in their eyes, was not a historical figure to be dissected like any other. He was divine. To mess with the image of Jesus was to mess with the foundation of their faith. The social media backlash was swift. Hashtags like #MuskIsWrong and #JesusWasWhite began trending almost immediately. Memes mocking Musk's theory flooded Instagram and Twitter. The joke among some circles was that Musk had finally gone too far, that the billionaire genius had lost touch with reality in his quest for relevance. But there was another side to the story. An unlikely movement began to take shape. one that had been simmering beneath the surface for years but had never been fully voiced. A growing number of people began to question the image of Jesus they had always been taught. Scholars, historians, and even some theologians who had studied the historical Jesus for decades saw Musk's claim as a conversation starter, one that could lead to a broader, more inclusive understanding of the historical figure. And they weren't alone. Social media platforms, particularly Twitter and TikTok, were filled with discussions on the topic. #JesusWasBlack began to gain traction as well, with users sharing articles, books, and theories that supported Musk's position. These weren't just random conspiracy theorists. Many of them were scholars, educators, and ordinary people who had long felt the historical image of Jesus didn't reflect the reality of his time or his surroundings. Think about it. One historian tweeted, "Jesus was born in the region we now call the Middle East, and he was part of a Semitic culture. Historically, that means he was more likely to have had features similar to those of people in northern Africa, not the northern Europeans we've been shown for centuries." A young black woman shared a heartfelt video on TikTok. "I grew up with images of a white Jesus in my church. But what if I could finally see myself reflected in him? What if the Jesus I grew up hearing about was never white at all?" Even the world's top racial justice activists weighed in. Many saw this as an opportunity to push the conversation about race and identity to new heights. They argued that if society could begin to accept the idea of a black Jesus, it could have deep, transformative implications for race relations, not only in America but across the globe. But the more the conversation spread, the more divisive it became. Religious fundamentalists dug in their heels, claiming that Musk's assertion was a direct attack on their faith. Others feared the potential chaos of rewriting religious history. Some critics suggested that Musk was merely using this for shock value, claiming that he was, as always, trying to distract the public from more pressing issues, like his ongoing ventures in space and AI. The situation became even more complicated when a group of theologians released a detailed counter-argument to Musk's claims. They pointed out that while certain evidence could be interpreted in various ways, there was little concrete proof to support the idea that Jesus was black. They argued that race, as we understand it today, wasn't a concept in ancient times, and therefore projecting modern racial categories onto historical figures was misguided at best. This only fueled Musk's resolve. He wasn't about to back down. If anything, he was more determined than ever to prove his point. Behind the scenes, Musk began assembling a team, a diverse group of experts, ranging from archaeologists to geneticists to theologians. Together, they would conduct a thorough investigation, poring over ancient texts, artifacts, and even DNA evidence to uncover what had been hidden for centuries. Musk's goal was clear. He would not only challenge the accepted image of Jesus, but would aim to provide undeniable proof. The stakes were enormous. If he was right, he would forever alter the way people thought about religion, history, and race. But if he was wrong, he knew the consequences would be severe. Public humiliation, loss of credibility, and an onslaught of legal challenges from religious organizations were just the beginning. But Musk didn't fear failure. He had never feared it. If anything, it drove him to dig deeper, push further, and confront the unknown. As Musk prepared to take his next steps, his personal life began to reflect the chaos around him. Family members, close friends, and even colleagues at Tesla and SpaceX expressed their concern. His latest public stunt, because that's how some of them saw it, was starting to strain relationships. Grimes, his partner, had been notably quiet on the issue, but Musk could sense her frustration. She had always supported his eccentricities, his quest for Mars, his electric cars, his deep dive into the future of humanity. But this felt different. One evening, while they sat in his office, she looked up from her phone and asked, "Elon, are you sure about this? This isn't just about a new business venture, right? This is about people's lives, their beliefs." He met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "Grimes, this isn't a stunt. This is about truth. We can't just go on accepting things because they've always been accepted. We have to question everything. The truth is out there, and I'm going to find it." Musk's resolve only strengthened. The battle was no longer just about a single tweet or a controversial statement. It was about pushing back against centuries of accepted history, exposing the cracks in the narrative, and challenging the very fabric of society's beliefs. In the coming days, as the world continued to divide, Musk would begin his journey in earnest. With his team of experts and his laser-like focus, he would embark on a mission that would either make him a visionary or a pariah. But either way, it was too late to turn back now. The conflict had only just begun. As the media frenzy around Elon Musk's claim continued to escalate, a surprising alliance began to take shape. Among the hundreds of individuals, scholars, historians, and curious onlookers who had been drawn into the debate, there was one group that Musk had not anticipated. A network of religious scholars and activists who had long questioned the dominant portrayal of Jesus. This was not a group of conspiracy theorists, nor was it a fringe movement. It was a coalition of theologians, sociologists, and cultural critics who had studied the historical Jesus for years and who believed, much like Musk, that the Western world's image of Christ was more a product of colonial influence than a reflection of historical fact. They had spent their lives challenging centuries-old assumptions about race, religion, and history, only to find their voices drowned out by mainstream narratives. But now, with Musk's tweet, they had the perfect opportunity to break through the noise. Musk first heard from Dr. Laila Al-Sayed, an Egyptian-born professor of theology at Harvard Divinity School. Laila had spent her career researching early Christian texts, particularly those from the Middle East and Africa. She was one of the foremost authorities on the Jewish roots of Christianity and had long argued that the portrayal of Jesus as a white man was both historically and theologically inaccurate. "I don't know if you realize this, Elon," Laila said when they first spoke, "but you've touched on something that a lot of us have been trying to bring to light for decades. The image of Jesus as a white, European figure didn't just emerge by accident. It was part of a centuries-long effort to reshape Christianity to serve the interests of European colonial powers. What you're saying may be more accurate than most people realize." Musk, who had always been accustomed to thinking in terms of technology and innovation, found himself drawn into a world he had never fully explored. There was something about Laila's passion and depth of knowledge that captivated him. She had spent years in dusty archives and ancient libraries, uncovering texts and artifacts that painted a different picture of the historical Jesus. And now, with the global stage at his fingertips, Musk realized that their combined efforts could shake the very foundations of religious history. Laila's words resonated deeply with him. If Jesus wasn't white, then why is he portrayed that way in so many churches, in so many countries? And why have people been so eager to silence those who ask this question? Musk, ever the disruptor, felt a sense of purpose growing within him. That's exactly what I'm trying to figure out. If we can prove that this image of Jesus isn't accurate, if we can show the world who he really was, then maybe we can finally start addressing some of the deeper issues in society today. Soon after, Musk was introduced to Dr. Jameson Reed, a prominent historian and professor at Yale University who had spent much of his career studying ancient manuscripts and historical records from the time of Jesus. Jameson, an African-American scholar, had been involved in several projects aimed at uncovering the African roots of Christianity, particularly the ways in which early Christian communities were influenced by African culture and history. "The truth is, Elon," Jameson told him, "most people have no idea how much African culture played a role in the development of early Christianity. The Bible itself has been edited, retranslated, and reinterpreted over the centuries. And much of what we've been taught about Jesus is the product of those revisions." Jameson's work had long been met with resistance from more traditional scholars, but now, with Musk's influence, he saw an opportunity to push his findings into the mainstream. He was particularly eager to work with Musk on uncovering evidence that could confirm the historical and racial context of Jesus' life. "What you've done is stir the pot, Elon," Jameson said with a chuckle, "but in the best way possible. This is the type of conversation that needs to happen. We need more people asking these questions, especially in light of the racial tensions that are still so pervasive today." Musk could sense that he had stumbled upon something far bigger than he had imagined. The academic community was now on board, and they had access to resources, ancient texts, DNA samples, and archaeological sites that could potentially validate his claim. The next step was clear: gather the evidence and let the world see it. Musk's team grew quickly as more experts from various disciplines offered their expertise. There were geneticists from Europe, who would analyze the DNA of ancient skeletons found in the region. Archaeologists from Israel, who had been working on excavating first-century burial sites, and theologians from diverse backgrounds who would sift through obscure religious texts, many of which had never been translated into modern languages. While the team worked tirelessly, the media continued to cover the story, with public opinion becoming more divided by the day. Some people felt that Musk's claim was a beacon of hope for racial justice, while others viewed it as an attack on their sacred beliefs. Yet, amidst all the chaos, one thing remained clear. People were paying attention. One day, Musk received a message that shocked him. It was from Pope Francis himself. The letter arrived by courier, handwritten in elegant script. Musk had grown accustomed to the constant stream of messages and correspondence that came with his status, but this one felt different. As he read through the Pope's message, he was taken aback by its tone. Dear Mr. Musk, while we, of course, do not share your conclusions regarding the race of our Lord and Savior, we are compelled to acknowledge that your recent statement has opened an important dialogue. Religion, like science, is a dynamic field, one that must evolve with our understanding of the world. You have ignited a discussion that many have been hesitant to engage with for centuries. I invite you to come to the Vatican. Let us discuss this matter in person. With respect, Pope Francis. The invitation stunned Musk. The Vatican, one of the most powerful religious institutions in the world, wanted to have a conversation with him about his claim? Could this be the start of something even bigger than he had imagined? He took a deep breath. This was no longer just about an academic exercise or a challenge to the status quo. This was about confronting centuries of entrenched religious and racial narratives in a very public way. Musk was torn. On one hand, meeting with the Pope could provide the credibility he needed to validate his theory. On the other, it was a dangerous game to play. The Vatican was powerful, and any misstep could lead to an all-out war, not just in the media, but within the religious world itself. He thought about it for a long time, weighing the risks and the rewards. Finally, he made his decision. I'll go, he said to his team. It's time to take this conversation to the highest level. We'll bring the evidence, and we'll bring the truth. The invitation from Pope Francis marked a turning point in Musk's journey. What had started as a provocative tweet was now a full-scale quest to uncover hidden truths, truths that had the potential to change not just how the world viewed Jesus Christ, but how humanity viewed itself. With the Pope's invitation in hand, Musk knew the next chapter of his journey would be one of the most crucial moments in his life. The world was watching, and soon, they would know the truth. But was the truth ready to be revealed? The journey to the Vatican felt surreal. For Elon Musk, a man who had already faced down rockets that almost exploded in midair and cars that were written off as impossible, this meeting was the latest in a long line of audacious moves. But unlike his ventures into space or electric cars, this was personal, and it could be the most consequential gamble he had ever taken. As the private jet descended toward Rome, Musk's mind was spinning. The plane hummed gently, but the quiet stillness didn't match the internal chaos that had been building since he'd agreed to meet with the Pope. He'd always been a man who operated at the edge of convention, but the Vatican, this was different. This was the heart of a global institution that had existed for centuries, built on traditions and beliefs that had shaped the world. Would they listen? Or would he be dismissed as another provocateur looking for attention? Musk was no stranger to controversy, but this was sacred ground. He couldn't afford to be wrong. Arriving at the Vatican, Musk was greeted by Cardinal Riccardo Vitelli, a tall, composed figure who had been tasked with hosting the meeting. The sun was beginning to set over St. Peter's Basilica, casting an orange glow over the piazza as they walked together toward the Apostolic Palace. You understand, Cardinal Vitelli began, his voice soft but serious, that this is not a conversation we take lightly. The Church's teachings are rooted in a tradition that spans over 2,000 years. What you have suggested has profound implications, not just for religious doctrine, but for the way millions of people view Christ and their faith. Musk nodded. I understand the gravity. I didn't expect this to be easy. As they entered the meeting room, Musk was introduced to several senior theologians who had come to discuss his controversial claim. Among them was Father Miguel Caruso, a Jesuit scholar with a reputation for being open-minded, but also for his deep commitment to traditional Christian teachings. Musk could tell immediately that Caruso was both intrigued and skeptical. "I've read your statements, Mr. Musk," Father Caruso said, his tone firm but measured. "And while I commend your dedication to uncovering truth, you must know that this is not simply a matter of historical fact. Jesus is, for us, not just a man from history. He is the Son of God. And that reality transcends race, culture, or ethnicity. Do you understand the weight of what you're asking the church to consider?" Musk took a deep breath. He had anticipated this line of questioning. The nature of his claim was, after all, a theological minefield. To many, the race of Jesus wasn't merely academic, it was a sacred matter. But Musk had come prepared. His team of historians, theologians, and archaeologists had spent months assembling evidence, not just about Jesus' possible racial background, but about the broader historical context of the time. "I do understand, Father," Musk replied, "but I believe that truth must be pursued, even when it challenges long-held assumptions. My claim isn't meant to diminish the divine nature of Christ. I believe in his divinity. What I'm questioning is the image that has been projected onto him over the centuries, particularly the Western image. We've been taught that Jesus looked like the people who colonized the lands where Christianity spread. But I'm asking, what if that image is not accurate?" Father Caruso looked at Musk, his brow furrowed. "And what do you hope to achieve with this? Is this an effort to change the way the faithful view their Savior?" Musk nodded. "It's more than that. If we understand Jesus as someone who lived in a specific time and place, someone with a particular racial and cultural background, we can begin to see the message of Christianity in a new light. The idea of a black Jesus isn't just a theological statement. It has the potential to change how we think about race, identity, and the history of the church. It can open the door to a more inclusive view of Christianity, one that embraces the full diversity of humanity." There was a moment of silence in the room as the theologians processed Musk's words. The tension was palpable. Cardinal Vitelli, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke. "You're suggesting that by redefining the image of Jesus, we could bring about a more inclusive understanding of faith?" "Yes," Musk said, "and that could have a profound impact on race relations and societal unity. Imagine the possibilities if we accepted the idea that Jesus wasn't a white European figure, but rather a person of color who shared a heritage with millions of people in Africa and the Middle East. It could break down barriers, especially in places where race is such a sensitive issue." Father Caruso shook his head slightly. "This is a radical shift, and it goes against centuries of tradition. The portrayal of Jesus has been, for many, an anchor, a symbol of spiritual continuity. You're asking us to reframe everything, and that is not something that can be done lightly, Mr. Musk." Musk knew this was a turning point. His team had prepared everything: documents, historical references, DNA studies, ancient texts. But it wasn't just about presenting facts. It was about shifting a worldview. The power of the Catholic Church could not be underestimated. If the Vatican accepted his theory, it would reverberate across the world. But what if they rejected it? What if they denounced him? The conversation continued for hours. Musk and the theologians debated, discussed, and sometimes disagreed. But amidst the intense exchanges, something began to shift. The theologians, who had initially been resistant, began to ask more nuanced questions. They weren't just rejecting Musk's theory out of hand. They were grappling with it. They were considering its implications. Finally, Cardinal Vitelli spoke again, his voice calm but thoughtful. "We need more time to consider your proposal. This is a complex matter, and while we do not take your claim lightly, we will look into it further. There are sources, after all, that suggest a different understanding of Jesus' heritage than what we have traditionally embraced. But we also need to understand the broader consequences of such a shift. It could have far-reaching effects, not only on the church, but on the very foundation of Christian belief." Musk nodded, sensing that the dialogue had shifted from rejection to exploration. This wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. There was room for discussion. As the meeting came to a close, Cardinal Vitelli extended an invitation to Musk to stay in Rome for a few more days. The Vatican, he said, would be conducting further research into Musk's claims. Musk agreed, knowing that this was a pivotal moment. Before he left the Vatican, Father Caruso pulled him aside. "You've started something, Mr. Musk," he said, his voice quieter now, almost contemplative. "The way people think about race, about faith, it's all tied to these ancient stories. What you're doing is more than challenging history. You're changing the way we see ourselves. And that is something no one can ignore." As Musk walked out of the Vatican, he felt a mix of emotions: relief, uncertainty, and the thrill of knowing that he had entered into a conversation that could change the course of history. But he knew this was just the beginning. The evidence had to be undeniable. The dialogue had only just started. And while the Vatican might be open to hearing his case, the world was another matter entirely. In the coming weeks, Musk would continue his investigation, pushing the boundaries of what was known. The world was watching. The stakes were high. And the truth, whatever it turned out to be, was waiting to be uncovered. After the intense meeting at the Vatican, Elon Musk couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was unfolding, though the path ahead remained unclear. The Vatican had agreed to continue investigating his claims, but Musk knew that the conversation didn't end there. If the world was to fully embrace this new understanding of Jesus' race, there needed to be irrefutable evidence, a combination of historical, cultural, and scientific proof. Musk's mind raced with ideas as he returned to California. His team, which had been working tirelessly for months, was now on high alert. They were not just preparing a response to the Vatican's inquiries. They were gearing up for an unprecedented global revelation. They had to prove, once and for all, that the traditional image of Jesus was a construct, an ideal that had been imposed by centuries of European colonialism rather than grounded in historical fact. The first step in this process was to revisit the evidence they had already gathered. One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence Musk's team had uncovered came from obscure, untranslated manuscripts, texts that predated the commonly known Gospels. These ancient scriptures, dating back to the early centuries of Christianity, hinted at a radically different image of Jesus. Dr. Jameson Reed, the historian Musk had worked with earlier, had discovered a fragment from a 3rd century manuscript known as the Gospel of the Hebrews. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which were written in Greek and Latin, this text had been written in a dialect of Aramaic that was used by Jewish communities in the Eastern Roman Empire. This is a key document, Jameson had explained when he first presented the fragment. It's one of the few remaining pieces of evidence that points to the Middle Eastern, Jewish roots of Christianity. In this gospel, Jesus is described not in the terms we are familiar with, no mention of blonde hair or light skin, but as a man with olive skin, dark eyes, and a distinctly Semitic appearance. Musk studied the texts in his lab, sifting through translations and notes as the pieces began to fall into place. The Gospel of the Hebrews wasn't the only document that made reference to Jesus in ways that contradicted the Western portrayal. There were other early Christian writings, some lost to history, others rediscovered, describing Jesus as a man who looked more like the people of North Africa and the Levant than the Aryan figure popularized in European art. "What we're seeing here," Musk said, standing up to pace in his office, "is evidence that from the very beginning, Jesus was depicted as a man of color. And somehow, over the centuries, that was erased. While ancient texts were essential, they could only take them so far. What Musk needed was something even more definitive, something grounded in physical evidence. That's when the team turned to cutting-edge forensic science. Dr. Lila Al-Sayed, the theologian from Harvard, had reached out to a friend who was a renowned forensic anthropologist, Dr. Eleanor Hayes. Dr. Hayes had spent years working on the reconstructions of ancient human faces using technology that could take bone structure and facial features into account to create a digital likeness of a person. "This is the science we've been waiting for," Dr. Hayes had said when they first met. "By analyzing the skeletal remains of people from the same region and time period as Jesus, we can create an accurate representation of what he might have looked like." The team gathered ancient skeletal remains from archaeological sites across the Holy Land, many dating back to the 1st century. Using 3D imaging technology, Dr. Hayes and her team painstakingly reconstructed several faces. While they couldn't say for certain which of these individuals resembled Jesus most, the results were eye-opening. The livestream took place in a high-tech studio, a stark contrast to the ancient world that Musk's team was investigating. Musk stood in front of a massive screen that displayed the forensic reconstructions and genetic data, explaining each step of the process in his characteristic style, clear, direct, and driven by a need for discovery. Over the past few months, we've uncovered something extraordinary, Musk began, his voice steady but laced with excitement. What we've learned changes everything we thought we knew about Jesus. His true image has been obscured for centuries, but thanks to groundbreaking scientific methods, we're finally able to present the truth. Jesus was not a white European man. He was a man of color, likely from the Jewish communities in the Middle East, with the physical characteristics that we see in the region today. He had dark skin, curly hair, and brown eyes. He looked like the people of the Levant and North Africa. As the screen flashed with images of the forensic reconstructions and DNA data, Musk's message was clear. This was not just a theological argument. It was a historical one, backed by irrefutable scientific evidence. The implications of this are profound, Musk continued. It's not just about history. It's about how we view ourselves and each other today. The image of Jesus has shaped the way we think about race, power, and identity. By restoring his true image, we have the opportunity to reshape the narrative of history and bring about a more inclusive future. The livestream was only the beginning. As the feed ended and the screens went dark, Elon Musk stood in front of the cameras, feeling an unfamiliar weight. The revelation was out there now, irreversible. He knew what came next, the reactions, and they would come fast. Within minutes, social media exploded. Thousands of comments, reactions, and memes flooded platforms from Twitter to Instagram. The hashtag #JesusWasBlack started trending worldwide. News outlets scrambled to cover the unfolding story, and television stations ran their special reports on Musk's groundbreaking claim. But not everyone was excited about this seismic shift. The initial wave of reactions was mixed. Some shocked, some skeptical, and others outright enraged. Social media users flooded Musk's feed with both support and backlash. A user named @TruthSeeker123 posted, "Finally, the truth is out. We've been lied to for centuries. Jesus was a man of color, and this changes everything." This comment quickly garnered thousands of likes and shares. But the backlash was just as intense. A well-known conservative political commentator, @LibertyLion, tweeted, "This is nonsense. What next? Are we going to say Moses was a superhero? The truth is, Jesus has always been depicted the way he was meant to be. Stop trying to rewrite history." This tweet, too, quickly gained traction, sparking a fierce debate online about the authenticity of Musk's claims. Religious leaders, scholars, and theologians from all corners of the globe began to weigh in. Some were cautiously open to Musk's findings, while others reacted with immediate rejection. Father Jonathan Alvarado, a prominent Catholic priest, wrote in an op-ed for the New York Times, "While the genetic and forensic data presented by Mr. Musk may be compelling, it misses a crucial point. The image of Jesus has always been symbolic, not literal. For us, Jesus transcends ethnicity and race. He is the universal Savior, not a man from a particular place and time." Meanwhile, Dr. Naomi Johnson, a professor of African American Studies at Harvard, tweeted, "I've been saying this for years. The historical Jesus was black, and the fact that it took this long to acknowledge it speaks volumes about how white supremacy has shaped religious narratives. This is a huge moment for black liberation and faith." As the debate raged on social media, the world's media outlets scrambled to cover the story. Major news networks like CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera devoted segments to the revelation, with pundits from both sides discussing the implications of Musk's claims. Within 24 hours, the Vatican issued an official statement. Cardinal Riccardo Vitelli, the same Cardinal Musk had met with during his trip to Rome, gave a carefully worded response. The Vatican has always believed that Jesus Christ's identity transcends any racial or ethnic category. We are all children of God, created in his image. While the findings presented by Mr. Musk are certainly fascinating, we must emphasize that the truth of the Gospels lies in the spiritual message of salvation, not in the physical attributes of Jesus. The Church will, of course, continue to investigate the matter further and encourage respectful dialogue on the topic. It was a diplomatic response, neither accepting nor rejecting Musk's findings, but leaving the door open for further examination. The Vatican's cautious tone gave Musk a sense of validation, but he knew that this wasn't the final word. The real battle lay ahead, not just in terms of facts and evidence, but in shifting the minds and hearts of people around the world. The announcement had created a chasm, dividing people in ways Musk hadn't fully anticipated. Some hailed the shift as an awakening, an opportunity for a more inclusive Christianity, one that reflected the global diversity of its followers. But others feared it would destroy the centuries-old image of a white Jesus that had been ingrained in Western culture. In the United States, this divide was particularly sharp. Churches in predominantly black neighborhoods embraced Musk's findings as a long-overdue revelation. For them, it wasn't just about history. It was about reclaiming their spiritual heritage. Pastor Rachel Hayes, a leader in one of Atlanta's largest African-American churches, delivered a passionate sermon on Sunday morning. "This isn't just about the color of Jesus' skin," she told her congregation. "This is about power, control, and who gets to shape the narrative. For too long, we've been told that the Son of God looks like the people who enslaved us. Now, we know the truth. Jesus was one of us." For many in her congregation, Musk's findings were a moment of liberation. They no longer had to reconcile the image of a white Jesus with their understanding of themselves and their history. Jesus, for them, was now a reflection of their own struggles, their own journey for justice and equality. But the reaction in more conservative, predominantly white areas was very different. Pastor Thomas Mitchell, from a large evangelical church in Texas, publicly denounced Musk's claims. "This is the latest in a series of attacks on traditional Christian values," he said in a televised interview. "We've been down this road before, attempts to rewrite history to fit modern political agendas. Jesus' message isn't about race. It's about salvation. We can't let these distractions steer us away from our true purpose." The division didn't just end in the church. It seeped into politics. Right-wing figures used the revelation to fuel their narratives about cultural wars, accusing Musk and his supporters of erasing history and catering to the woke agenda. Meanwhile, progressive voices hailed it as a victory for racial justice and an overdue acknowledgement of marginalized communities' place in the Christian story. As the controversy raged on, Musk remained steadfast. He knew this wasn't just about him or even about Jesus. It was about a larger, more profound shift in how history, race, and religion intersected in the modern world. In a series of interviews and press conferences, Musk expanded on his vision. "What we're talking about here is not just a historical revelation," he said. "It's about tearing down the walls of division that have been built over centuries. It's about understanding that our shared humanity is more important than the physical differences we've allowed to separate us. By acknowledging the truth about who Jesus really was, we can begin to see each other as equals, as brothers and sisters in this world." His words resonated with millions, but there were still many who didn't want to hear them. The backlash against Musk intensified. Some accused him of using his platform to distract the world from more pressing issues, like the climate crisis or economic inequality. Others felt that the very foundations of their faith were under attack. For Musk, however, the stakes were never higher. The truth he had uncovered went beyond any single religious figure. It was about the world's understanding of itself. It was about confronting the lies that had shaped society's views of race, power, and privilege. Musk knew that no matter how much resistance he faced, this was just the beginning. The world was not going to change overnight. But perhaps, just perhaps, he had started something that could alter the course of history. As Elon Musk's revelations about Jesus' true racial identity continued to ripple across the world, the storm of reactions intensified. The social and political ramifications of the discovery were felt in every corner of society: religious, academic, cultural, and even economic. For Musk, the truth had been revealed, but the battle to reshape history and dismantle centuries of cultural narratives was far from over. The academic world, particularly scholars in the fields of history, theology, and anthropology, was divided. Some hailed Musk's findings as groundbreaking, while others rejected them outright. The idea of challenging centuries of accepted theological and historical understanding was too much for many traditional scholars to accept. Dr. Sarah Whitaker, a professor of ancient history at Yale, was one of the few historians who supported Musk's revelations. She wrote a widely circulated article in the Journal of Religious Studies entitled "Reconstructing the Image of Jesus," New Perspectives on Old Narratives. In it, she argued that the historical evidence was irrefutable. The Mediterranean world in the time of Jesus was not populated by light-skinned individuals, but by people with olive skin, dark eyes, and Semitic features. Her article included references to archaeological discoveries, ancient texts, and the forensic reconstructions that Musk's team had developed. Incorporating these findings into our understanding of Jesus is not just a theological matter, it's a historical necessity, Dr. Whitaker wrote. By erasing the racial identity of Jesus, we are allowing centuries of whitewashed Christianity to distort our understanding of a man who lived in a different time, place, and culture. His racial identity is key to understanding not just his life, but also the development of Christianity and its impact on the world. Her article was a touchstone for many academics who had quietly shared Musk's concerns but lacked the platform to bring them to the forefront. For some, however, it was seen as a betrayal. Dr. Kenneth Thompson, a professor at Princeton and a vocal critic of Musk's findings, fired back in a heated debate on a national news show. This is not just about history. It's about faith. What Elon Musk has done is attempt to rewrite the very foundation of Christian belief, Thompson argued. Jesus is not defined by his race. He is defined by his message. We should focus on what he taught us, love, compassion, and forgiveness, not on how he looked. Thompson's comments were a reflection of the larger theological and cultural debate that was now playing out. It wasn't just about ancient history anymore. It was about the identity of faith itself. The political ramifications of Musk's revelation were no less explosive. In the United States, the divide over Musk's claims had stark political overtones. Conservative pundits, already skeptical of Musk's tech-driven worldview, saw this as another front in the so-called culture wars. We've seen what happens when revisionist history gets in the hands of the left. First, they want to rewrite American history, and now they're coming for Jesus, said Senator Richard Hayes, a Republican from Texas. Elon Musk has done more to divide this country than unite it. We need to focus on real issues, not these distractions. His words resonated with many of his supporters, particularly in rural, more conservative areas. For them, the image of Jesus as a white European man was symbolic of their values and history. The idea of challenging this image was seen as an attack on their worldview, one they were unwilling to abandon. On the other side, progressive politicians and social justice movements embraced Musk's revelation as a victory for racial equity. Congresswoman Maria Vasquez, a rising star in the Democratic Party, took to Twitter to share her thoughts. The revelation that Jesus was a man of color challenges everything we've been taught about race, power, and privilege. It's time to confront the ways that white supremacy has shaped not just our politics, but our spirituality. In major urban centers with large Black and Latinx populations, Musk's claims were seen as part of a broader movement toward reclaiming marginalized histories. They believed the acknowledgement of Jesus' true racial identity was part of a cultural awakening that would allow communities of color to find greater agency in telling their own stories. But for many in the conservative camp, this was a slippery slope toward rewriting not just history, but the very foundations of religious faith and Western civilization. As the debate spiraled, the media outlets covered the controversy from every possible angle. Talk shows, news programs, and cable networks were abuzz, discussing the implications of Musk's findings. Some were respectful of the new evidence, while others took a more sensational approach, turning the conversation into a circus. One particularly heated segment on Fox News featured pundit Laura Davis, who denounced the entire claim as a blatant attempt to undermine Christianity and sow division. What Musk is really doing here is attempting to undermine the very basis of Western civilization, she said on air. Jesus has always been a symbol of purity, sacrifice, and salvation. To claim he was not white is to erase the historical context of Christianity's spread across Europe and the Americas. This is nothing short of revisionist history designed to tear down our values. The opposing view was presented by Dr. Lena Harper, a historian and professor of religious studies at Stanford University, who appeared on CNN. Christianity is not defined by skin color, but by message and mission, Dr. Harper argued. What Musk has done is present a historical fact. Jesus was a man of color, and it's time for the world to understand the significance of this. Christianity grew in the Middle East and Africa, and the original followers were black, brown, and Jewish. To pretend that doesn't matter is to ignore history. As the debate continued to dominate the media, Musk became a polarizing figure. Some saw him as a truth-teller, a disruptor of established norms. Others saw him as a dangerous force, intent on stirring up unnecessary division and chaos. While the intellectual, political, and media battles raged on, a deeper, more personal struggle was unfolding for many believers. For some Christians, especially those who had been raised with the traditional, westernized image of Jesus, the idea that he was not white was deeply unsettling. It wasn't just about historical facts, it was about identity. Jesus, for them, had always been the ultimate figure of authority and moral guidance, and his image was intertwined with their sense of self. For those in the black and brown communities, however, the revelation was liberating. The idea that Jesus looked like them, and that his story, rooted in the struggles of the oppressed, had been historically distorted, resonated deeply with their own experiences of marginalization. They saw the news not just as a correction of history, but as a chance to reclaim a part of their spiritual inheritance that had been denied to them for centuries. As these communities processed the revelation, many began to re-examine their own faith in light of this new understanding of Jesus. Some felt a profound sense of connection to him in a way they had never before. Others, particularly within the Black church, began to explore how this new knowledge could change their approach to evangelism, social justice, and the way they represented the gospel to the world. For Musk, the journey had never been about religion, at least not in the traditional sense. His quest was about uncovering the truth. But as the weeks went by, he began to realize that the implications of his discovery were far more profound than he had initially understood. This wasn't just about science and history. It was about faith, identity, and the way humanity viewed itself through the lens of religion. Pastor Marcus Bell, a widely respected evangelical leader in the Midwest, made headlines when he denounced Musk's claims during a Sunday sermon that was broadcast nationwide. "This is an attempt to rewrite the Bible," Bell declared from the pulpit, his voice thick with emotion. "Jesus is not defined by race, and anyone who tries to change that is undermining the core of Christianity. We need to stand firm in our faith and not let these radical ideas confuse us." The sermon sparked protests outside churches across the country as religious conservatives rallied against Musk. They held signs that read, "Jesus is the Savior, not a political tool," and "Stop the lies. Jesus is white." Meanwhile, in African-American communities, the message Musk had revealed was met with a completely different reaction. Across the country, Black churches began hosting special services and discussions about Musk's findings. The mood was one of empowerment and renewed faith. "Jesus was one of us," said Pastor Diane Richards in a powerful sermon delivered at a church in Detroit. "For too long, we've been told that we had to worship a white, European Christ in order to be saved. Now we know the truth. Jesus was a man of color. This changes everything." For many in the Black community, the confirmation of Jesus' racial identity was more than just historical. It was a spiritual revelation. It opened up a deeper connection to their faith, one that acknowledged their history, their struggles, and their identity in a way that had never been possible before. As the debate raged, Musk found an unlikely group of supporters in the form of Hollywood celebrities and high-profile public figures. Actors, musicians, and athletes began to speak out in favor of Musk's revelations, adding a layer of cultural cachet to the conversation. Rihanna, who had always been vocal about issues of racial justice, tweeted, "We've always known. Time to change the narrative. Jesus was Black, and his story belongs to all of us." Her tweet quickly went viral, sparking conversations across social media about race, religion, and identity. Similarly, rapper Kendrick Lamar, known for his thought-provoking lyrics about racial and social issues, took to Instagram with a post that read, "Truth always comes out. History is written by the powerful, but now the truth about Jesus is ours to reclaim." The support of these high-profile figures gave Musk's movement a kind of mainstream legitimacy, especially among younger generations who were increasingly open to questioning traditional narratives about race, religion, and history. But for many, this was just another example of celebrity culture hijacking an important conversation. Conservative voices, including Fox News host Laura Davis, pounced on the celebrity endorsements, arguing that they were simply adding fuel to an already controversial fire. The Hollywood elite and the woke agenda want to tell you what's true, but we need to remember that truth is not decided by Twitter polls or Instagram posts, Davis said in a blistering segment. They're out of touch with reality, and their influence is dangerous. Meanwhile, the global reach of Musk's revelation continued to grow. International protests, debates, and discussions began to unfold across the world. In Brazil, where Christianity is the largest religion and many people of African descent worship, the revelation struck a chord with millions. Large crowds gathered in cities like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo to hold rallies and prayer meetings, celebrating the image of a black Jesus as both a religious and cultural icon. In parts of the Middle East, particularly among Arab Christians, there was skepticism about Musk's findings. While many agreed with the scientific evidence, the concept of a black Jesus was a difficult pill to swallow for those who had long identified with a more Europeanized image of Christ. It is hard to reconcile this with the image of Jesus that we have lived with for centuries, said Nabil Hassam, a church leader in Cairo. But history is history, and we must be open to accepting it, even if it challenges everything we've known. As the media blitz continued and the reactions from every corner of the world mounted, Musk found himself reflecting more and more on the impact of his revelation. He had never anticipated the level of emotional and cultural intensity it would provoke. What had started as an academic project, an exploration into the historical Jesus through forensic technology, had turned into a global movement, a challenge to the status quo, a reckoning with centuries of racial and religious dogma. At times, the criticism was overwhelming. Musk's Twitter feed was flooded with insults, threats, and calls for him to take it back. But in quiet moments, when he took a step back from the storm, he was resolute. He had made the right decision, and no amount of opposition was going to sway him. For all the pain, the controversy, and the division it caused, Musk believed that the truth was worth it. "We've spent too long living in the shadows of lies," Musk told his inner circle one evening. "And now, the light is shining on a truth that's been hidden for centuries. We can never go back." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The fallout from Elon Musk's shocking claims continued to echo across the globe, but something unexpected was happening in the wake of the controversy. A new movement was slowly taking shape. What had initially seemed like a divisive revelation began to unite people in ways Musk never anticipated. A conversation about race, faith, history, and power had emerged, and it was spreading far beyond the world of technology and academia. In the streets of major cities around the world, New York, London, Lagos, and Jakarta, there were signs of something stirring. Protests, rallies, and peaceful demonstrations calling for a reevaluation of how history had been written started to gain momentum. What began as isolated pockets of support for Musk's findings was growing into a full-fledged global movement for racial justice, historical accuracy, and religious reformation. People from various racial and ethnic backgrounds began to voice their desire for a more inclusive portrayal of Jesus, not just as a man of color, but as a symbol of unity. For the first time in centuries, communities that had felt excluded from the central narrative of Christianity found themselves at the forefront of a new dialogue. In South Africa, Pastor Thabo Ndlovu, a well-respected leader in the African church, held a series of online live streams where he discussed the implications of Musk's findings. The streams went viral, drawing thousands of viewers from across the continent. The Jesus we've been taught about for centuries is not the same Jesus that was born in Bethlehem. It's time for the church to embrace the truth. For the sake of unity and healing, Pastor Ndlovu declared in one of his broadcasts, "This is not just a theological shift, it's a cultural revolution." In the United States, the movement began to be called the Reclamation Movement, a collective effort to reclaim the true identity of Jesus Christ, remove the historical distortions, and reconnect with the origins of Christianity. While some church leaders were resistant to the movement, many others, especially within Black and Latino communities, embraced it. The African American church, in particular, found new life in the idea of a Christ who reflected their own struggles, triumphs, and cultural identity. As the movement expanded, the philosophical implications of Musk's claim began to take center stage. Scholars and theologians from around the world began to engage in deeper discussions about the impact of race on the development of Christianity. Dr. Amina al-Mansouri, a philosopher of religion at the University of Cairo, published an influential paper titled The Color of Christ: Reconciling Faith with History. In it, she explored how the Western depiction of Jesus as a white man had played a key role in shaping colonial narratives, white supremacy, and the exploitation of people of color. This is about more than just the color of Jesus' skin, Dr. al-Mansouri wrote. This is about confronting a long history of racial injustice that has been perpetuated by misrepresenting the very person who is supposed to be the ultimate figure of love, equality, and justice. Dr. al-Mansouri's work became a touchstone for the intellectual backbone of the movement. It gave a theoretical framework for understanding how the racialization of Jesus had been used to justify centuries of oppression and marginalization. Meanwhile, in Western theological circles, the debate continued to grow. Traditionalists rejected the idea that Jesus could be anything other than a Middle Eastern man who had been depicted in European art. They argued that race was irrelevant to the message of Jesus and that focusing on his ethnicity was a distraction from the essence of his teachings. In contrast, progressive theologians and scholars rallied around Musk's claim as a way to restore the true context of Jesus' life. One prominent voice was Dr. Julian Harris, a theologian at Duke Divinity School, who spoke at a major conference on racial justice and religion. Jesus was a man of the people, marginalized, oppressed, and from a group that has always been underrepresented in the dominant narratives, Dr. Harris said during his keynote speech. It's time to confront the image of a white Jesus that has been used as a tool of empire and control. We need to embrace a more accurate portrayal of his identity to understand the radical nature of his message. The Reclamation movement began to spill over into the economic realm, influencing everything from advertising to the entertainment industry. For decades, the image of Jesus had been a commercial product used to sell everything from religious paintings to holiday decorations. Now, with the debate about Jesus' true identity at the forefront, a new market for more accurate depictions of Christ began to emerge. In Hollywood, filmmakers started to take notice. Director Ava DuVernay, known for her work on Selma and When They See Us, began working on a new film project that would explore the true story of Jesus, with a focus on his historical context and his identity as a man of color. The film was announced to widespread acclaim, and casting calls were soon flooded with actors from diverse backgrounds. Hollywood has ignored the true roots of Christianity for too long, DuVernay said in an interview about the project. It's time to tell the story of Jesus as it truly happened, and not as a Western construct. This film will give people of color the representation they deserve in the story of salvation. Meanwhile, global companies began to reevaluate the religious imagery they used in their marketing. Online retailers like Amazon and Etsy saw a dramatic rise in sales of depictions of a black Jesus. People wanted art, clothing, and even home decor that reflected a more inclusive version of their faith. The once overlooked demand for diverse religious symbols was now becoming a multi-million-dollar market. As the world continued to react to his revelations, Elon Musk found himself at the center of an increasingly complex global movement. He was no longer just a tech mogul or a business leader. He had inadvertently become the face of a cultural revolution. His decision to share his findings with the world had shaken the foundations of not just religion, but also society's understanding of race, power, and identity. For Musk, the attention was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He had always been someone driven by a need to challenge the status quo, to push boundaries, and to uncover hidden truths. But this was something entirely different. The stakes were higher, the consequences more far-reaching. Late one evening, as Musk sat in his private office at SpaceX headquarters, he reflected on how his life had changed in the months since the revelation. He stared at his computer screen, scrolling through social media threads, watching as the world debated and dissected every aspect of the story he had sparked. Some praised him as a truth-teller, others vilified him as a dangerous radical. But despite the personal cost, Musk remained unwavering in his conviction. We have to confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes people feel, he said quietly to himself. We have to do better. We have to be better. This isn't just about Jesus. It's about who we are as people. who we are as a society. As the global movement continued to gain momentum, Musk prepared for what would be the next chapter in his journey, a journey not just of technological innovation, but of spiritual and social reformation. The road ahead was uncertain, but Musk knew one thing for sure: the world was never going to be the same. As the months passed, the global movement surrounding Elon Musk's revelation began to take on a life of its own. What initially seemed like an isolated debate had turned into a transformative force. But, as often happens with movements that challenge deeply entrenched beliefs, the battle lines were becoming more clearly drawn. Musk had become an even more polarizing figure than before. Yet, in the midst of the growing tension, an unexpected figure would step forward, one whose support of Musk's cause would add another layer of complexity to the conversation. Dr. Reverend John Daniels, a renowned African-American theologian and historian, was not someone who had previously been on Musk's radar. A deeply respected leader within both the academic and religious communities, Daniels had spent decades studying the early roots of Christianity, its cultural impact on African peoples, and the ways in which religion had been manipulated throughout history. His work had earned him accolades, but also the ire of conservative factions who saw him as a revolutionary within the church. When Dr. Daniels first heard Musk's claims about Jesus being a person of color, he didn't immediately jump on the bandwagon. He was a cautious man, deeply committed to his faith, but not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom. It wasn't until he received a private invitation from Musk to meet in person that Daniels began to reconsider his stance. Musk had invited him to SpaceX headquarters for a private discussion, and, intrigued, Daniels agreed. Their first meeting was nothing short of unexpected. Musk, who had always been viewed as an eccentric and visionary tech mogul, greeted Daniels warmly with a casual handshake. There was no grand introduction or ceremony, just two men sitting across from each other in a minimalist office space that could have easily been mistaken for an artist's loft. "I've read your work," Musk said, breaking the ice, "and I have a lot of respect for how you've approached this issue of racial justice and Christianity. That's part of the reason I wanted to meet." Daniels, who had never met Musk before, was somewhat taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. He had expected to find a tech CEO who was more concerned with branding and publicity than actual substance. But there was something different about Musk, something that resonated with the historian. "I appreciate that," Daniels said, leaning forward, "but I'm curious. What makes you, someone who is outside the traditional religious world, believe that this is a conversation worth having?" Musk paused for a moment, his eyes flickering as he gathered his thoughts. "The more I learned about history, the more I realized how much of it was rewritten, how much of it was manipulated to fit a particular narrative. When I started looking at the historical Jesus, I realized that the image we've been taught is not the full truth. I felt a responsibility to share that truth." Daniels nodded slowly, processing Musk's words. "That's a powerful statement, Elon. But the truth is often uncomfortable, and sometimes challenging long-standing beliefs can have consequences far beyond what we anticipate." Musk smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I'm prepared for that. I've seen the consequences of standing by the truth in my own life, but I believe it's worth it." Over the course of their several meetings, Daniels and Musk developed an unlikely partnership. Daniels, who had long advocated for a more inclusive view of Christianity that acknowledged the experiences and cultures of people of African descent, found Musk's relentless pursuit of truth compelling. Musk, in turn, saw Daniels as a voice of reason, someone who could bridge the gap between the intellectual, secular world and the deeply religious communities that were grappling with his claims. Together, they began to craft a message that would not only address the racial implications of Musk's findings, but also provide a framework for how faith and history could coexist in a more inclusive, honest way. They began writing a book, tentatively titled The Truth of Christ: Reclaiming History, Reclaiming Faith, which would offer both a historical and theological argument for understanding Jesus as a man of color. "People need to understand that this isn't just about the skin color of Jesus," Daniels said in one of their discussions. "It's about the fact that for centuries, the image of Christ has been used to uphold a system of oppression and exclusion. We're not just reclaiming the truth about Jesus, we're reclaiming the very foundations of Christianity itself." Musk nodded in agreement. "Exactly. This isn't a political statement. It's a spiritual one. It's about returning to the core values of Christianity: love, inclusion, justice, all of which have been overshadowed by the false image of a white Jesus. When Dr. Daniels publicly endorsed Musk's findings, it was a turning point in the broader conversation. His credibility as an academic and religious leader lent significant weight to Musk's claims, and many who had previously dismissed Musk as a tech mogul with no understanding of theology began to reconsider their stance. Daniels' endorsement was widely covered by both religious and secular media. His well-respected position within the African American church gave his words a unique power, especially among Black Christian communities. Church leaders who had previously been resistant to Musk's claims were now faced with the undeniable fact that a respected theologian and historian was supporting Musk's vision. In a powerful sermon delivered from his pulpit in Atlanta, Pastor James Richardson, a key leader within the African American church, spoke directly about the newfound alliance between Musk and Daniels. "This is not a battle against our faith," Pastor Richardson said. "This is a fight for the truth. Dr. Daniels and Elon Musk are calling us to a higher understanding of who Jesus truly was. And if we are to follow Christ in truth, then we must embrace all aspects of his identity, his true identity." The sermon was broadcast live and quickly became a touchstone for churches across the country. More and more congregations began to hold discussions about the true identity of Jesus and what it meant for the future of Christianity. As the Reclamation movement continued to grow, its racial implications became clearer. The debate was no longer just about the historical Jesus. It was about the deep-seated racial inequality embedded in Western religious traditions. For centuries, the dominant portrayal of Jesus had been used to justify racial discrimination and colonialism. The Reclamation movement was calling for a radical reimagining of Christianity, one that acknowledged the humanity of all people, regardless of race or ethnicity. Dr. Daniels, in one of his most public appearances since endorsing Musk, spoke passionately about the need for reconciliation and healing. "We cannot heal as a society until we confront the ways in which we have been taught to dehumanize people of color. The false image of Jesus is a symptom of a much larger problem. If we are to move forward, we must return to the truth of who he was, and in doing so, we must confront the systems of power that have used his image to dominate and oppress." As the global movement continued to evolve, Musk found himself not just at the helm of a technological revolution, but also at the heart of a cultural and spiritual one. The ideas he had unleashed about race, religion, and history were beginning to take root in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. His partnership with Dr. Daniels only added fuel to the fire, as the two worked together to bring their message to a wider audience. But in the quiet moments, when the chaos of public life slowed down, Musk often wondered if the world was truly ready for the changes they were advocating. Would people accept the uncomfortable truths they were pushing forward? Or would they resist, clinging to old beliefs that had been passed down for centuries? In the end, Musk knew one thing for certain. The truth had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how much people tried to bury it. As the movement to reclaim the true identity of Jesus Christ continued to expand, the global reaction became increasingly polarized. While many people embraced the new narrative and found comfort in the inclusion of a Christ that resonated with their own identity, there were those who could not and would not accept the challenge to centuries of religious tradition. The backlash, particularly from conservative religious circles, grew louder and more intense. In the days following Dr. John Daniels' endorsement of Musk's claims, the reaction from certain Christian groups was swift and unforgiving. The Church of the Sacred Truth, a powerful evangelical organization, issued a public statement condemning both Musk and Daniels for what they termed blasphemy disguised as progress. The statement warned that challenging the divinely inspired depictions of Jesus was not only theologically irresponsible but dangerous. "The attempt to rewrite the racial identity of our Lord is a direct attack on the sacred truths passed down through millennia," the statement read. "This movement is a distortion of God's word and a manipulation of history to fit modern ideological agendas. We will not stand idly by as they try to reshape Christianity to suit their political views." In response, Musk tweeted, "The truth should never be considered a threat. We are simply questioning a narrative that has excluded millions for too long." Despite Musk's calm response, the firestorm continued to grow. Critics from both religious and political spheres began to align against Musk, and his followers saw a deepening divide between those who accepted his vision and those who believed he was leading people astray. The cultural and political implications of the Reclamation movement spread beyond the church, spilling into national discourse. In the United States, political figures began to weigh in on the issue, with some using it as a rallying cry for their bases. Republican Senator Michael Harris from Texas, a staunch conservative, delivered a fiery speech on the floor of the Senate, condemning the movement as part of a broader agenda to undermine Western values. "This is an attack on the very foundation of our culture," Senator Harris declared. "They want to rewrite our history, reframe our religion, and twist the very essence of who we are as a nation. We cannot allow this." On the other side of the aisle, progressive activists rallied behind the movement, emphasizing the need for greater racial justice and inclusivity within religious institutions. Representatives like Maria Gonzalez from California expressed their support for Musk's initiative, calling for an end to the centuries-old narrative that ignored the history of people of color. "The movement isn't just about race," Gonzalez said at a rally in Los Angeles. "It's about truth, justice, and healing. It's about making Christianity relevant to all people, not just to those in power." The media played a crucial role in the escalating divide. News outlets on both sides began to pick apart every detail of the debate, from Musk's past statements to Daniel's theological arguments. The narrative shifted from a debate about historical truth to a battle over ideological purity. The lines between faith, race, politics, and identity became increasingly blurred. As the backlash grew, Musk began to feel the weight of the consequences. He had expected resistance from some quarters, but the depth of the animosity took him by surprise. Social media was flooded with vitriolic comments, some questioning his sanity, others attacking his character. Musk's once solid brand was starting to erode. Tesla's stock price, which had been soaring during his earlier business successes, began to fall as conservative groups called for boycotts of his companies. Online campaigns spread like wildfire, with people pledging not to buy from Tesla, SpaceX, or any of Musk's other ventures. The noise was deafening, and it was affecting his businesses. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Musk took to Twitter to address his critics. "I didn't start this movement to tear people apart. I started it to bring people together," he wrote. "We've spent centuries ignoring the truth, and we're finally starting to confront it. It's uncomfortable, but that's what progress looks like." But even as he spoke out, the pressure was mounting. He was no longer just a businessman. He was the face of a revolution, one that threatened to disrupt the very core of the world's religious and social order. At home, the toll on Musk's personal life was becoming more apparent. His relationships with family and friends began to fray under the strain. His ex-wife, Justine Musk, a writer and advocate for social causes, became increasingly concerned about his involvement in the controversy. While she supported his right to speak his truth, she worried that the personal cost was too high. "Elon, this is bigger than any venture you've ever taken on," Justine said during one tense conversation. "You're not just challenging tech companies anymore. You're challenging the way the world sees God. That's not something that's easily won." Musk looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I didn't expect it to be easy, but it's necessary. People need to know the truth, even if it makes them uncomfortable." While the movement found a growing base of support among progressive Christians and those outside the traditional church, it also became clear that it was creating a deep rift within the Christian community itself. Many religious leaders who had once seen themselves as protectors of the faith were now forced to take sides. In the Southern Baptist Convention, one of the largest and most conservative Christian organizations in the United States, a special council was called to address the controversy. The council quickly issued a statement rejecting Musk's findings. "The portrayal of Jesus as a man of color is a distortion of the truth," the council declared. "While we recognize the importance of racial equality, this movement is an attempt to hijack the gospel message and force a political agenda on Christianity. We will not allow this misrepresentation to take root in our churches." Yet, in the Black church, the movement was taking on a very different form. Many African-American pastors and scholars welcomed the conversation, seeing it as an opportunity to reclaim a part of Christianity that had often been whitewashed over the years. Pastor Karen Williams, a prominent figure in the Black church, spoke out passionately in support of Musk and Daniels during a sermon that was broadcast live. Jesus was a man who lived in the Middle East, a place where people looked like me, looked like us, she said, her voice rising with emotion. For too long, we've been told to ignore the truth about his identity, and it's time to take back our rightful place in this story. This isn't just about Jesus. This is about us. This is about our history, our dignity, and our future. Her words resonated deeply within her congregation and beyond, sparking conversations in churches and community centers across the nation. Despite the fierce opposition, Musk's influence continued to grow. The movement, though divisive, had ignited a wider cultural conversation about race, religion, and identity that could no longer be ignored. As the backlash intensified, Musk became a figurehead for a new generation of thinkers, activists, and believers who were determined to change the way the world viewed religion and themselves. But as the movement gained strength, Musk knew that the road ahead would not be easy. He would have to face not only the consequences of challenging a global institution, but also the personal cost of standing by his convictions. The question now was whether the world, and particularly the church, was ready for the changes he was proposing, or whether he was truly prepared for the firestorm that was still to come. The storm was approaching, and Elon Musk knew it. The backlash against his movement, though expected, had escalated to levels he hadn't predicted. What began as a challenge to the traditional portrayal of Jesus had grown into an ideological war, a fight for the very soul of Christianity. With each passing day, the divide between the supporters and detractors of the Reclamation movement deepened, and tensions were starting to spill over into dangerous territory. Despite the vocal opposition from conservative religious groups, Musk and Dr. John Daniels continued to gain traction, particularly within marginalized communities and progressive religious circles. The Reclamation movement had become a global conversation, one that transcended national borders. Activists, scholars, and religious leaders from across the world began to rally behind Musk's vision, speaking out against the centuries-old, whitewashed depiction of Jesus and calling for a re-examination of historical truths. In Brazil, one of the largest Christian populations in the world, a massive rally was held in the heart of Rio de Janeiro, organized by a collective of progressive Christian groups and civil rights activists. They marched through the streets chanting, "Jesus was black, and we claim his truth." The movement had struck a chord in Latin America, where the indigenous and Afro-descendant populations had long been sidelined by Eurocentric religious narratives. Meanwhile, in parts of Africa, the Reclamation movement found fertile ground. The continent, home to one of the fastest-growing Christian populations, had seen centuries of colonial influence that reshaped the region's religious identity. Activists like Bishop Samuel Okoro in Nigeria took to social media to express their support, calling the movement a necessary reckoning with Africa's colonial history and religious identity. Jesus was a man of color, Bishop Okoro declared in a viral video. This truth should not be controversial. It is time we take back our history, our faith, and our dignity. The movement had become a rallying cry for those who had felt marginalized, not only within their churches, but within the world. And in many ways, it was becoming bigger than just the racial identity of Jesus. It was about dismantling centuries of religious control and power structures. But with growing support came increasing hostility, and Musk began to realize just how dangerous this ideological battle could become. The backlash was not limited to words anymore. It was turning violent. Hate groups and extremist factions within the conservative Christian community, many of whom had felt their religious identity was under siege, began organizing protests. Some even called for action to stop the movement before it could gain more ground. In the South, a group calling themselves the Defenders of the True Christ took to the streets, carrying signs with slogans like, "Jesus was white, and that's the truth, and this movement is heresy." Their rallies, though not officially sanctioned by any religious organization, gained considerable media attention and were attended by thousands of angry demonstrators. On one occasion, a peaceful protest organized by Reclamation movement supporters in Dallas turned violent when members of the Defenders of the True Christ clashed with activists. Fights broke out, and several people were injured. The police arrived late, and the news outlets quickly descended upon the scene, further amplifying the tensions. Musk had never been afraid of controversy. He thrived on it. But even he had to admit that the violence was something he hadn't anticipated. The situation was escalating faster than he could have imagined, and he realized that it wasn't just his reputation on the line. It was the safety of everyone involved in the movement. Amid the chaos, one person remained steadfast in their belief that the truth Musk was revealing was worth fighting for. Dr. John Daniels. Though Daniels had long been an advocate for social justice and had faced his own share of criticism throughout his career, the growing animosity against Musk and the movement took its toll on him as well. In a private meeting at his church in Atlanta, Daniels expressed his concerns to Musk. "I knew this would be difficult, but the level of vitriol is unlike anything I've ever seen. They're not just attacking us, they're attacking the very idea of truth. And if they can silence us, they will silence everyone who dares to challenge the status quo." Musk leaned back in his chair, his face drawn with concern. "I didn't expect it to get this bad, John. But you're right. This is bigger than us. It's about the narrative they've been feeding people for centuries, and they're willing to do anything to protect it." Dr. Daniels nodded. "But we cannot back down now. If we do, the truth will remain buried, and generations will continue to live under the lie that Jesus was someone he wasn't. We've come too far to turn back now." Despite the mounting pressure, Daniels' words strengthened Musk's resolve. He knew that the movement was changing the world in ways he could never have imagined. The stakes were high, but he had come to understand that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable or controversial, needed to be told. As Musk and Daniels prepared to take the next steps in their movement, they were faced with a decision that would change the course of history. The tension between the opposing sides had reached a boiling point. With each passing day, it was becoming clearer that this was no longer a simple debate. It was a battle for the future of Christianity itself. Musk's allies, activists, theologians, and ordinary people who had been inspired by the Reclamation movement began to realize that their voices were being drowned out by the cacophony of opposition. It wasn't enough to speak up on social media anymore. They needed to take their message to the masses in a way that couldn't be ignored. Musk, who had always prided himself on using technology to bring people together, decided that the next logical step would be a global broadcast, a live, worldwide event that would allow the movement to reach millions, if not billions, of people simultaneously. The broadcast would feature Musk and Daniels, as well as other religious leaders, scholars, and activists, all coming together to discuss the truth of Jesus' identity and the need for a new, inclusive vision of Christianity. The idea of such a high-profile broadcast was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a bold step toward unity and understanding, while others viewed it as nothing short of a provocation, a public spectacle designed to tear down the foundations of Christianity. Musk knew the risks. There would be backlash, certainly, but there was also the chance that this event could galvanize the movement, draw in millions of new supporters, and finally force the world to reckon with the truth that had been buried for so long. And so, he made the call. The announcement of the global broadcast sent shockwaves across the world. News outlets, social media platforms, and religious organizations immediately began preparing for what would be one of the most highly anticipated and highly scrutinized events in modern history. The stakes had never been higher. As the date for the broadcast drew nearer, Musk, Daniels, and their supporters prepared for the possibility that this moment could either change the world or tear it further apart. In the days leading up to the event, tensions flared. The defenders of the true Christ vowed to do whatever it took to shut down the broadcast, including staging protests outside the venues where the event would be streamed. A massive campaign of misinformation also began to spread, with fake news stories claiming that Musk and Daniels were satanic agents attempting to destroy Christianity from within. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Musk remained resolute. He had come too far to back down now, and the world was watching. The day of the broadcast arrived with the weight of history pressing heavily on Elon Musk's shoulders. For weeks, he and Dr. John Daniels had been preparing for what would be the most pivotal moment of their lives, a live, global event designed to push the world to face the truth about Jesus Christ's racial identity and the historical injustices that had been ignored for centuries. It was, as Musk had stated so many times, about more than race. It was about reimagining the future of religion itself. In the hours before the broadcast, the tension was palpable. Musk stood backstage in the high-tech, state-of-the-art auditorium, surrounded by his closest allies and a team of engineers who had worked tirelessly to ensure the event would go off without a hitch. The cameras were set, the speakers tuned, and the virtual audience from around the world was already filling up the digital space. Dr. Daniels sat quietly, meditating in a nearby room. The scholarly theologian, who had been Musk's most trusted ally throughout the journey, had made it clear from the outset that this moment wasn't just a public spectacle, it was a mission. They were about to speak truths that had been buried for too long. Musk paced nervously. For all his accomplishments, SpaceX, Tesla, Neuralink, he had never been so uncertain about the outcome of a project. The stakes here were unlike anything he had ever encountered. If this broadcast succeeded, it would reshape the global understanding of Christianity. If it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for his reputation, but for the future of the movement. "Are you ready?" Dr. Daniels asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but Musk could sense the underlying tension. The moment was drawing near. Musk took a deep breath and nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The live stream began at exactly 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and within moments, millions of people from across the globe were tuned in, their eyes glued to the screens, waiting for the message that could alter the course of history. News outlets, social media platforms, and religious networks all picked up the feed. The eyes of the world were on them, from New York to Nairobi, from London to Lagos, from Seoul to Sao Paulo. This was a moment that transcended boundaries. The first thing the viewers saw was the face of Elon Musk, standing confidently at a podium, with a backdrop displaying images of diverse faces, each one representing different racial and ethnic groups. The message was clear. The world was made up of many people, and the truth Musk and Daniels were about to unveil was one that applied to everyone. "Good evening," Musk began, his voice steady but with a hint of urgency. "Tonight, we gather not to start a revolution, but to tell a truth that has been hidden for far too long." The camera cut to Dr. John Daniels, seated beside him, holding a thick leather-bound book, an ancient Bible. Daniels smiled softly, his expression that of a man who had prepared for this moment for a lifetime. "This is not just about a race," Daniels said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable power. "It's about the identity of a man who changed the world, and who was, and still is, one of us." The reaction in the digital world was immediate. Social media platforms exploded with hashtags like #JesusWasBlack, #ReclaimingTruth, and #HistoryUnveiled. People shared their excitement, anticipation, and some even fear, with every second that passed. The world was on the edge of its seat. Musk continued. "For centuries, the image of Jesus has been shaped by Western artists, political powers, and colonial influences. What we see today is not the truth of who Jesus was. This image has been constructed to fit a specific agenda. But tonight, we aim to bring truth into the light." He gestured to the large screen behind him, which displayed a famous painting of Jesus, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure in the classical European style. The image was instantly recognizable, the one seen in churches, homes, and institutions all over the world. "Here's the problem," Musk continued. "This is not the Jesus described in the Bible. This is an image created by European painters centuries after Jesus lived. A whitewashed version designed to fit a narrative that erased the identity of the Middle Eastern Jewish man who walked this earth." The camera cut to a map of the ancient world. Musk pointed to the region surrounding modern-day Israel, where Jesus was born and lived. "Jesus was a man of color," Daniels added, "born in a region with a rich and diverse population." Historians, archaeologists, and theologians have all pointed out the fact that the people of the Middle East, at that time, were not white. They were people of color, with features that reflected the region's rich ethnic diversity. The screen then displayed images of ancient Jewish people from the time of Jesus, depictions drawn from archaeological evidence, reflecting the reality of the region during the 1st century CE. Musk's voice echoed in the auditorium as he spoke. Jesus would have looked more like someone you'd find in modern-day Egypt, Syria, or Palestine, not Northern Europe. As Musk and Daniels made their case, the audience's response was explosive. Social media exploded with conversations, debates, and heated discussions. Thousands of people joined the live chat, expressing their emotions in real time. In the United States, hashtags like #BlackJesus and #TruthReclaimed trended worldwide. Celebrities and influencers, some with large followings in the Christian community, shared their support for the movement. The movement's message began to reach people on a deeply personal level. Many of them felt liberated by the idea that Jesus, a man central to their faith, might have more in common with them than they had ever been told. One prominent voice in the evangelical community, Pastor Michael Clark, a well-known leader in the African American church, tweeted, "Finally, this is the truth we've been waiting for. Jesus was a black man, and we need to reclaim his legacy." #reclaiming truth. Meanwhile, religious scholars, particularly those from marginalized communities, praise the movement for opening the conversation on racial justice within the church. "This is a moment of profound reckoning," said Dr. Elena Ramirez, a scholar of ancient religious texts from Mexico. "What Musk and Daniels are doing is making the truth accessible. We need this dialogue." However, as expected, the reaction from conservative Christian groups was swift and vehement. Religious leaders and organizations denounced the broadcast almost immediately. A statement from the National Christian Coalition condemned the event, calling it an unprecedented heresy and an affront to the traditional teachings of the church. "This movement seeks to undermine the very fabric of our faith," read the statement. "The depiction of Jesus in white robes with golden hair is based on historical and theological tradition, and it represents the divine truth. To suggest otherwise is a rejection of sacred scripture." In response, Musk calmly tweeted, "We are not rejecting scripture, we are revealing truth. Let's have this conversation openly." But as the online arguments raged on, the tension began to spill over into real-world confrontations. Protests erupted outside of churches and religious centers across the United States. Some rallies turned violent, with counter-protesters clashing with Reclamation movement supporters. The religious divide was becoming sharper, and the political fallout was immense. As the broadcast concluded, Musk stood alongside Daniels, the weight of their words settling in the air. The world was watching, divided, confused, yet also hopeful. The battle had only just begun. Musk looked to Daniels, his voice low. "Do you think we've done it? Changed the conversation?" Daniels gave a small nod. "This is just the beginning. We've opened a door. Now, it's up to the world to walk through it." As they walked off the stage, Musk felt a sense of both triumph and trepidation. The world had heard their message. The question now was how it would respond. Would this be the moment that sparked true change, or would the forces of opposition prove too powerful to overcome? In the hours and days following the broadcast, the world seemed to split in two. The ripple effects of Elon Musk's bold revelation that Jesus was black reverberated across continents, sparking heated debates, fierce protests, and even violent clashes. Some hailed the broadcast as a revolutionary moment of truth and justice, while others decried it as an affront to centuries of religious tradition. Musk had known this would be controversial, but nothing could have prepared him for the scale of the reaction. The world had just been given a new lens through which to view history, religion, and race, but not everyone was ready to look. For many, the broadcast was a moment of liberation. People from marginalized communities, especially those who had long felt excluded from the power structures of both religious and societal hierarchies, saw Musk and Daniels' message as a long-overdue affirmation of their lived experiences. It wasn't just about race. It was about reclaiming identity and dismantling oppressive narratives that had distorted both history and theology. On social media, hashtags like #JesusWasBlack, #ReclaimingTruth, and #TruthForAll surged in popularity. In cities across Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, groups of people gathered to discuss the implications of the broadcast. People spoke passionately about their newfound understanding of Jesus and how his true identity could change their relationship to Christianity. "I always knew something was off about the white Jesus in my Sunday school books," said Maria, a young woman from São Paulo, Brazil, during an impromptu discussion at a local church. "I never felt connected to that image. But this feels like the truth. Jesus was a man like us, born from a culture we can relate to. This changes everything." In Nairobi, Kenya, a group of students from the University of Nairobi held a public discussion about the broadcast. One of the students, Kwame, a theology major, said, "This isn't just about race. This is about how colonization distorted our understanding of our own faith. Jesus was a revolutionary, and he was one of us. We need to go back to the roots of our faith, not the watered-down version they gave us in church." Across the Atlantic, in the U.S., the African American church community felt a surge of validation. Pastors, scholars, and everyday churchgoers came together in large congregations to discuss the significance of the broadcast. Many felt that the long history of racial inequality and marginalization within Christianity was finally being addressed head-on. Pastor Michael Clark, the well-known African American evangelical leader, held a televised sermon the night after the broadcast. His message was clear: Elon Musk and Dr. Daniels have done what the church should have done centuries ago. They've given us back our truth. This is a moment of reckoning for all of us. But it wasn't just marginalized communities that were reacting. The broadcast had struck a nerve with people from all walks of life. Young people from progressive Christian circles, social justice activists, and even some secular individuals found themselves asking deeper questions about the power structures in religious institutions and the historical narratives they had inherited. However, for every voice of support, there were many others who saw Musk and Daniels' message as an attack on their faith and a dangerous challenge to the religious status quo. Across the United States, especially in the conservative heartlands, the broadcast was met with fury. The National Christian Coalition, the Southern Baptist Convention, and a number of influential evangelical leaders issued swift condemnations. To them, Musk's broadcast was nothing short of sacrilege. In a joint statement, they argued, "This movement is a distortion of the teachings of Christ and an assault on the truth. Jesus is depicted as a white man because that is how he has always been understood, and that is how he is presented in Scripture. These attempts to rewrite history are dangerous and disrespectful." Pastor John Hawkins, a prominent figure in the evangelical community, took to national television to rally his followers against the Reclamation movement. "This is nothing less than an attack on the very foundation of our faith. If we allow these lies to go unchallenged, it will only lead to further confusion, division, and destruction of our moral compass as a nation." Hawkins' words resonated with many conservative Christians. The backlash grew louder, and soon protests against the Reclamation movement erupted in major cities across the United States. Outside churches, megachurches, and religious institutions, large groups of angry demonstrators gathered, waving signs that read, "Jesus was white, and that's the truth. This is heresy," and "Stop rewriting history." As tensions escalated, the protests began to take a more violent turn. In Los Angeles, clashes between supporters of the Reclamation movement and the defenders of the true Christ turned chaotic. Bottles were thrown, people were shoved to the ground, and at least one protester was hospitalized after being hit by a car. The local police struggled to contain the unrest, and the media began covering the growing violence. Musk, who had always prided himself on being able to handle controversy, began to feel the weight of the fallout. This was no longer just an intellectual debate. It was a fight for the very soul of Christianity itself. Even more alarming was the rise of far-right extremist groups who began using the broadcast as a rallying point for their own agenda. White supremacist organizations, some of whom had long used Christianity as a tool to justify their hateful ideology, condemned Musk's message as a dangerous attack on Western civilization. They claimed that the movement to blackwash Jesus was part of a broader conspiracy to destroy the cultural foundations of the West. In response, Musk took to Twitter, the platform he had long used to communicate with his followers. "We're not attacking anyone's faith," he tweeted. "We're simply asking for an honest conversation. This is about the truth, and truth is never something to fear." But despite his calm, it was clear that the storm was intensifying. The division in the U.S. was growing deeper, with not only religious leaders but political figures also weighing in. Senators and representatives, especially those from the conservative wing, spoke out, calling for unity in the face of division and accusing Musk of trying to tear apart the fabric of American Christianity. As the debate raged on in the United States, the Reclamation movement continued to gain ground abroad. In Europe, the movement found unlikely allies among progressive religious groups, who saw in Musk's message an opportunity to bridge the gap between religion and social justice. Activists in Germany, France, and the UK organized rallies and debates, advocating for a more inclusive portrayal of Jesus and the reclamation of Christianity as a religion for all people, not just a select few. In India, where Christianity is a minority faith, the movement sparked conversations about the historical connection between Christianity and colonialism. Activists in places like Kerala and Goa, where Christianity has deep roots, began questioning how European colonial powers had shaped the Church's portrayal of Jesus. Meanwhile, in Israel, where the legacy of Christianity's portrayal of Jesus has always been contentious, the Reclamation movement sparked a national conversation about the need for religious tolerance and understanding. Some leaders in the Jewish community expressed support for the idea of re-examining historical narratives to promote greater inclusivity and cultural awareness. As the dust began to settle after the chaos, Elon Musk and Dr. Daniels found themselves at a crossroads. Their movement had ignited a firestorm of controversy, but it had also sparked a global conversation about race, religion, and history. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The truth they had uncovered had forced the world to confront uncomfortable realities. Whether the world was ready for those truths remained to be seen, but Musk and Daniels had started something that couldn't be undone. In a private meeting, Daniels turned to Musk and said, "We knew this wouldn't be easy, but the work has just begun. The hardest part isn't telling the truth, it's living with the consequences. Are we ready for what comes next?" Musk smiled faintly, his eyes tired but resolute. "I didn't come this far to back down now. The truth will always find its way." And with that, they both knew. Their battle was far from over. The world had changed in ways they could never have predicted, and the story of Jesus, along with the fate of the Reclamation movement, was still unfolding. The weeks following the broadcast saw the world shifting under the weight of Elon Musk and Dr. John Daniels' claims. What had begun as a digital revelation now had the power to affect the very structures of religion, politics, and culture. While the controversy was intense and often hostile, it was also clear that the Reclamation movement had taken root in places both expected and unexpected. Yet the question loomed: what would come next? What would the true cost be for those leading the charge? In the United States, the division was growing deeper by the day. Social media platforms, once filled with excitement over the prospect of a changed narrative, were now battlegrounds for both sides. Supporters of the Reclamation movement continued to rally behind the hashtag Jesus was Black, sharing personal stories of how the message had transformed their faith, while critics dug in, arguing that history and scripture could not be rewritten based on modern ideologies. Churches were no longer just places of worship. They had become sites of protest, with some religious leaders calling for boycotts of certain denominations that embraced the new narrative. The National Christian Coalition announced a series of events to restore the true image of Christ and defend the traditional Christian faith against what they considered secular revisionism. Yet there were cracks within the church itself. Some denominations, especially those with large African American congregations, began to express support for the Reclamation movement. Black pastors, who had long felt the sting of a faith system that had been appropriated by the oppressors of their ancestors, began to speak out. Pastor Michael Clark, who had become one of the most vocal supporters of Musk's message, continued to advocate for a full reevaluation of Christian teachings, saying, "The church has been hijacked by powers that have turned the faith into a tool of colonialism, oppression, and exploitation. We must return to the true roots of the gospel. And that means acknowledging that Jesus was not the image of the whitewashed savior we've been fed for centuries." Internationally, the movement was gaining more traction. While some nations pushed back due to the deeply entrenched histories of colonialism and Eurocentric Christianity, other countries were embracing the conversation with open arms. In Latin America, many felt a renewed sense of pride. Christianity had been brought to the region through colonial conquests, with the image of a white Jesus instilled in the culture as a tool of domination. Now, the Reclamation movement was being embraced as a path toward decolonizing religion. In Brazil, church leaders began to incorporate more indigenous and Afro-Brazilian perspectives into their sermons, noting that Christianity could be a faith of liberation rather than one of oppression. In the Philippines, where Catholicism had deep roots, The movement began to resonate with the people who felt their national identity had been shaped by centuries of Spanish rule. "We are reclaiming Jesus for the Filipino people," said Father Jose Antonio, a leading Catholic priest in Manila. "For too long, he has been presented as a foreign, white figure. But the Jesus of the Bible is one of us." In South Africa, where the legacy of apartheid was still raw, many churchgoers expressed support for the movement. The Reverend Thabo Madiba, a well-known figure in the South African Anglican Church, commented, "This is a prophetic moment for the church in Africa. For too long, we've been told that Jesus was a white European. But now we see him as a part of our struggle, a part of our identity." As the movement spread, the backlash from conservative and fundamentalist Christian groups became more aggressive. Leaders from all over the world gathered in Rome for an emergency meeting, calling for unity in the face of theological division. The Vatican issued a statement reaffirming the traditional Christian depiction of Jesus, declaring, "The Church must stand firm in its teachings. The image of Christ, as understood through centuries of tradition, is not something that can be redefined based on modern ideologies." Pope Benedict XVI, despite being retired, issued a letter from his residence, warning of the dangers of distorting the image of Christ. The letter went viral, sparking debates not only within the Catholic Church but also among Protestant groups who shared similar views on the preservation of traditional images. In response, Musk fired back. "The truth is not something we can bury. For too long, our images of Christ have been dictated by colonial powers and Western empires. It's time for a global reckoning, a time to return to the roots of Christianity." With the public discourse surrounding the Reclamation movement continuing to intensify, Musk found himself facing unprecedented pressures, not just from religious groups, but also from corporate partners. Tesla, SpaceX, and other ventures he controlled began to feel the heat. Some of his major corporate partners, worried about potential losses from key conservative markets, began quietly distancing themselves from Musk's personal endeavors. Several multinational companies in the energy, aerospace, and technology sectors issued statements clarifying their positions on the matter. A prominent shareholder in SpaceX, Thomas Richards, expressed concern about the unnecessary politicization of Musk's public profile. "We're here to make rockets and advance space exploration, not to take sides in divisive theological debates," he said during an interview with CNBC. Musk was unfazed. "We're here to change the world, and sometimes that requires a confrontation with the old systems of power." This confrontation, however, was beginning to test the limits of his influence. People who had once admired Musk for his innovative thinking now began to question his motivations. Was he truly a visionary, or was he merely another billionaire trying to make a splash in the world of social justice? Behind the scenes, the strain of this global battle was taking its toll on Musk. His family life was becoming increasingly strained. His ex-wife, Tallulah Riley, reached out to him privately, expressing concern about his involvement in such a volatile movement. "Elon, you're changing the world, but at what cost?" she asked during a late-night phone call. "You're risking everything, your companies, your reputation, and your peace of mind. Is this really worth it?" Musk paused, his mind racing. "Sometimes you have to risk everything for something greater. This movement is bigger than me, bigger than any of us. If I don't push forward now, who will?" But even Musk couldn't deny that the pressure was getting to him. The ceaseless demands from the media, the relentless backlash from conservative groups, and the threat of financial losses all weighed heavily on him. Every day felt like a battle, and even though his conviction was strong, the mounting tensions left him wondering if he had the endurance to see it through. As the world became more divided, Musk realized that simply defending his message wasn't enough. If the reclamation movement was to truly succeed, it needed to become more than just a conversation. It needed to become a global call to action. One afternoon, as he sat in the headquarters of SpaceX, Musk called a meeting with Daniels and his closest advisors. "We need to take this to the next level," he said. "We've made our case. Now, we need to mobilize. If we want this to be more than just a flash in the pan, we need to build a movement, a coalition of people from all walks of life who believe in this truth." Daniels, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, spoke up. "What exactly do you have in mind?" "We need to organize protests, but peaceful ones. We need to put pressure on the churches to acknowledge this new truth. We need to create a global movement that puts racial justice at the forefront of Christianity, not as a side issue, but as part of its very foundation. Musk's voice grew more passionate. If we truly want to change the course of history, we need to get people involved. The way forward isn't just through arguments, it's through action. It's about demonstrating that this truth matters, that it changes the world. And so, the groundwork for a new phase in the reclamation movement was laid. The call to action had gone out. The world was changing. What had started as an intellectual debate, one sparked by Elon Musk's revelation that Jesus was black, had now become a full-fledged global movement. The ideas surrounding this shift were spreading like wildfire, but the true challenge lay ahead. How to turn this philosophical and theological debate into a true, worldwide rallying cry for racial justice, equality, and inclusion. Elon Musk knew that if the reclamation movement was to have lasting impact, it needed to transform from a media spectacle into a real, tangible movement. He and Dr. Daniels began to strategize on how to mobilize the millions of people who had supported the movement thus far. The initial surge of excitement on social media had been impressive, but now it was time to organize, to take to the streets, to put pressure on the structures that had long perpetuated the dominance of whitewashed Christianity. Their first step was the creation of an international coalition of activists, faith leaders, and scholars who shared the vision of a more inclusive, racially aware Christianity. They called themselves the Reclaimers, and their mission was simple: reclaim the image of Christ, reclaim the truth of history, reclaim faith for the oppressed. Musk poured millions of dollars into creating a robust digital platform, not only for the movement's publicity, but to serve as an organizing tool for communities. The platform, called Reclaim Truth, allowed people from all over the world to connect, organize protests, and engage in dialogue. But Musk and Daniels knew that online action was just the beginning. "This is bigger than the internet," Musk said during a press conference announcing the launch of the platform. "This is about taking our message to the streets, to the churches, to the very institutions that have, for centuries, distorted the image of Christ and prevented true racial justice from flourishing in Christianity. Our battle isn't just ideological, it's practical. We need to act." Less than a month after the announcement, the first of many planned marches took place. It was held in Johannesburg, South Africa, where the racial legacy of apartheid still loomed large. Thousands of people, from all walks of life, came together to protest the historical misrepresentation of Jesus and to demand that Christian institutions recognize the role of race in the faith's evolution. The protest was a mixture of religious fervor and social justice, and it had a powerful impact. Under the banner of the Reclaimers, the protesters walked peacefully through the streets, singing hymns and chanting slogans like, "Jesus was black, and so is my faith," and "Decolonize the church, reclaim the truth." The crowds were diverse, black and white, Muslim and Christian, young and old, united by a common cause. Musk watched the footage from SpaceX headquarters, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and trepidation. He knew this was just the beginning. What had begun in Johannesburg would soon spread to the rest of the world. Within weeks, protests and marches were organized in London, Lagos, New York City, Sao Paulo, and beyond. The Reclaimers' message was simple but radical. They were demanding the religious and historical recognition of Jesus as a person of African descent. This was about more than race. It was about confronting centuries of colonization, religious manipulation, and systemic oppression. As the marches grew larger and more frequent, the Church's response became more pronounced. The Vatican called for an emergency meeting of the world's bishops to discuss the growing movement. Pope Francis, in a rare address to the global media, stated, "We must address the underlying issues of race, colonization, and the misrepresentation of Jesus in our faith, but we must do so with compassion, unity, and truth. The Church has historically failed to address these matters in a way that is inclusive and truthful. It is time we reconcile with our past." For many, this was a powerful statement. Pope Francis had long been a figure advocating for the downtrodden, but his remarks did not go far enough for the Reclaimers. They were pushing for a radical shift in how the Church viewed not just Jesus, but its entire history of oppression. Dr. Daniels responded to the Pope's speech with a powerful tweet. "Reconciliation is necessary, but it is not enough. The truth must be embraced in its entirety, not selectively. The Church must acknowledge its role in the colonization of Christianity. The Vatican's response was both conciliatory and defensive. Cardinal Joseph Gerhardt, a senior church official, stated that the Church would review its teachings, but there was no intention to change the depiction of Jesus in religious art or doctrine. This sparked a renewed wave of protests, this time outside the Vatican itself. In cities across Europe, protests targeted cathedrals and museums that displayed iconic portraits of a white Jesus. In Rome, demonstrators gathered outside St. Peter's Basilica with banners that read, "Decolonize Jesus. Decolonize the Church." The media coverage of the Reclamation movement was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it provided massive exposure to the cause, allowing Musk and Daniels to amplify their message globally. On the other hand, it often distorted or oversimplified the movement's true goals. Mainstream outlets picked up on the controversy, spinning sensational headlines that framed Musk as a modern-day heretic and the movement as a threat to the established order. News outlets often juxtaposed images of peaceful protests with violent clashes, painting the movement as a growing source of societal unrest. The media frenzy only fueled the fire on both sides. In the midst of the chaos, Musk issued a calm and measured statement. "We are not here to tear down anyone's faith. We are here to uncover the truth. We are here to ask difficult questions and to ensure that future generations inherit a faith that is inclusive, honest, and empowering for all people." Despite the growing protests and the media storm, the movement's momentum didn't slow down. For every critical headline, there was a new viral video from a protest, a new blog post from a religious scholar, a new speech by a leader of the movement who spoke about the importance of truth and reconciliation. Amid the tumult, the Reclamation movement began to see tangible wins. In the summer of 2024, an influential museum in Paris, the Musée d'Orsay, announced it would begin removing whitewashed depictions of Jesus from its permanent collection. This decision, though small in scope, was heralded as a symbolic victory for the movement. For the Reclaimers, this was just the beginning. The idea that an art institution, which had long been a bastion of European colonial culture, could acknowledge its role in misrepresenting history was a sign that the conversation was moving in the right direction. In the United States, several progressive churches began to update their religious iconography, replacing traditional images of a white, European Jesus with depictions of a black or brown Christ. This, too, was seen as a sign of hope. The shift wasn't instantaneous, but the momentum was undeniable. As the movement spread, Elon Musk found himself more entrenched in the controversy than ever before. His companies, under pressure from shareholders, began to face public criticism for their CEO's increasingly political stances. Musk had long been used to dealing with intense pressure, but this was different. Dr. Daniels, who had become the intellectual figurehead of the Reclamation movement, found himself in a similar position. His lectures, once a calm exploration of theological history, were now watched by millions, and each word he spoke was scrutinized. At a private meeting, Daniels looked at Musk with a weary expression. "We're changing the world, but at what cost? How much more can we endure?" Musk looked out over the chaos, his eyes reflecting both exhaustion and resolve. "We're just getting started. The world needs this truth, John. They need it now more than ever. And if we have to fight for it, then we will." The Reclamation movement had reached its fever pitch. What started as a controversial claim about the true identity of Jesus had morphed into a worldwide confrontation with centuries of religious, political, and cultural history. The global reckoning had begun, and it was clear that it would not be easy for anyone to return to the status quo. The growing protests, debates, and activism led to the first major international summit convened to discuss the future of the movement. Hosted in Geneva, Switzerland, the Global Reclamation Summit brought together religious leaders, activists, scholars, and representatives from various governments to discuss the implications of the Reclamation movement and how to move forward. Elon Musk and Dr. John Daniels were invited to speak at the summit, and their presentation was met with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The conference hall was filled with representatives from all walks of life: African American pastors, European theologians, Black Lives Matter leaders, scholars of religious history, as well as political figures from all corners of the globe. Musk, looking out over the sea of faces, couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. What had once been a solitary mission, a personal crusade, was now a movement that could no longer be ignored. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. "This is about more than religion," Musk began, his voice steady. "This is about acknowledging the truths we've buried for far too long. It's about giving power back to those who have been denied their history, their identity, their dignity. And in doing so, we hope to create a future that's more just, more honest, and more inclusive." The audience listened intently. There were murmurs of agreement, but also tension in the room. Some viewed Musk's words as radical. Others saw them as the key to a necessary revolution in both faith and society. After Musk finished, Dr. Daniels took the stage. He was a calm and measured presence, but there was an intensity in his eyes. His words resonated with the crowd in ways that Musk's more technological vision could not. Daniels spoke of the historical context that had led to the erasure of Black Jesus from the Christian tradition. He spoke of the theological importance of reclaiming this identity and what it meant for the future of the church and the world. "What we are doing here today is more than simply reimagining Jesus' image," Daniels said. "We are reclaiming the dignity of those who have been oppressed in the name of Christianity. We are acknowledging that the power structures that have controlled the narrative for so long are not above accountability." The summit would last for days, with countless panels, debates, and discussions. By the end of the week, a resolution was passed. The church, as well as several other faith groups, agreed to review and potentially revise the way they represented Christ in religious imagery, with some denominations officially acknowledging the role that colonialism and racial bias had played in shaping their depiction of Jesus. Though the summit had yielded a tentative agreement, the impact was felt most acutely within Christian communities. The decision by some denominations to embrace the Reclamation movement was welcomed with open arms, but others rejected it outright. The Catholic Church, despite its initial concession, made clear that it would not be changing its doctrine. The Evangelical Church, in particular, became a vocal opponent. Leaders like Pastor Timothy Harris, one of the most influential evangelical figures in the United States, called the movement a dangerous and divisive ideology. "This is not about truth or justice," Harris said during a televised interview. "This is an attempt to subvert the gospel and inject political correctness into the very fabric of our faith. Jesus Christ is the Savior of the world, and his identity is not up for debate." In the U.S., this backlash was particularly intense. Conservative Christian groups, bolstered by media outlets like Fox News and the Christian Broadcasting Network, amplified their objections. The term, "Jesus was black," became a lightning rod for conservative talking points, often framed as a threat to traditional values. However, the controversy only added fuel to the fire. While many Christians were deeply offended by the Reclamation movement, others began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. These were the communities that had long been excluded from mainstream religious narratives: the Black churches, the Latinx communities, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who were beginning to see their faith through a different lens. They were beginning to reclaim not just Christ's image, but also their own identity within the Christian tradition. Pastor Michael Clark, now one of the leading voices of the Reclamation movement, gave a powerful sermon at his church in Atlanta. "For too long, the image of Christ has been used to oppress and marginalize. We've been told that Jesus, the very symbol of our faith, looked nothing like us. But now, we know the truth. And that truth is liberating." The movement was no longer just a religious debate. It had become a political issue. Political leaders around the world began to weigh in, with varying degrees of support or condemnation. In the United States, Representative Sarah Rivera, a progressive Democrat, became a vocal supporter of the movement, calling it the most important reformation of Christianity in over 500 years. Rivera introduced legislation aimed at promoting racial justice in religious institutions and funding educational programs that would teach the true, diverse history of Christianity and its global influence. Across the aisle, conservative politicians like Senator James Hawk condemned the Reclamation movement, calling it a threat to the moral fabric of American society. "We cannot allow a small but vocal group to rewrite history and disrupt the values that have made America great. The image of Christ is sacred, and it's not something we can change just to appease the masses." The political polarization only deepened as the conversation surrounding Jesus' racial identity became entangled with broader cultural wars. Conservative pundits, religious leaders, and politicians decried the Reclamation movement as yet another example of woke culture run amok, while progressives hailed it as an essential step toward healing long-standing racial wounds. In Europe, leaders like French President Emmanuel Macron expressed support for the broader goals of the movement, emphasizing the need for dialogue and reflection on how colonialism had shaped modern religious thought. Yet even in more progressive European nations, the backlash was strong. In Italy, thousands of protesters marched to the Vatican demanding that the Church reject the Reclamation movement. They were met with counter-protests from groups that supported the idea of a more inclusive Christianity. Despite the political and religious pushback, the cultural impact of the Reclamation movement could not be denied. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers began to explore themes of racial identity and faith in ways they had never done before. Documentaries about the history of African Christianity began to emerge, showcasing the deep, rich history of Christianity in Africa long before colonialism arrived. Hip-hop artists incorporated references to a Black Jesus in their music, while Black filmmakers and artists created visual representations of Christ that embraced African, Afro-Caribbean, and Afro-Latinx identities. The world was slowly, but surely, beginning to accept the notion that the image of Jesus could look different to different people. The Reclamation movement had sparked a global conversation, not just about race, but about the very nature of faith and identity. For Musk, the movement had become more than a cause, it was his legacy. As he watched the world unfold before him, he found himself grappling with questions that had little to do with technology or space exploration. Had he pushed the world too far too fast? Was this battle worth the cost? One evening, as he sat alone in his office, staring out at the stars, Musk reflected on the path that had brought him here. He had always been driven by the need to disrupt systems and create new realities. But this was different. This wasn't a business model or a product to be sold. This was the very foundation of human identity and spirituality. He thought back to his conversation with Tallulah Riley, his ex-wife, who had warned him about the personal toll this battle would take. Musk had dismissed her concern at the time. Now, sitting alone, he wondered if she had been right. But then, a message from Dr. Daniels popped up on his screen. Elon, the fight is only beginning. We can't turn back now. The world needs us. Musk nodded to himself. No matter the cost, no matter the pressure, the battle was worth it. The global reckoning had begun, and there would be no turning back. The Reclamation movement had reached a crossroads. What began as a philosophical challenge to centuries of theological misrepresentation had now evolved into a global conflict. The clash between tradition and progress, between the conservative defenders of historical narratives and the advocates for truth and justice, had grown sharper. The stakes were higher than ever before. As the movement spread, the world found itself increasingly divided. In the United States, the debate over the racial identity of Jesus became a symbol of the larger culture wars. Conservative Christians rallied behind the idea that the image of Christ must remain unchanged, while progressive communities saw the rejection of Black Jesus as another piece of the larger system of racial injustice. The United Nations, in an unprecedented move, called for an international summit on religious freedom and historical representation. The summit, held in late 2024 in New York City, became a focal point for the world's most influential religious leaders, scholars, activists, and politicians. It was clear that the Reclamation movement was no longer confined to a single theological discussion. It was now a battleground for the future of global identity. Elon Musk and Dr. Daniels arrived at the summit as two of the most prominent figures in the Reclamation movement, but neither was sure what to expect. The atmosphere was charged with tension, as representatives from every major world religion were present. The debate over Jesus' racial identity had quickly transformed into a conversation about the very nature of faith, history, and representation in modern societies. The first day of the summit was dedicated to speeches and presentations. Dr. Daniels delivered a stirring address on the historical context of racialized Christianity. He spoke passionately about the ways in which European colonial powers had used Christian doctrine to justify slavery, apartheid, and the oppression of indigenous peoples worldwide. For Daniels, the image of a white Christ was not just an issue of art. It was a tool of colonial oppression. Musk, on the other hand, took a more technological approach. He spoke about the power of digital platforms to create global awareness and shift the conversation on race and religion. He introduced a new initiative that would use AI and virtual reality to create interactive experiences that allowed people to experience history through the lens of those who had been erased. Musk's tech-driven vision was futuristic and compelling, but it lacked the emotional depth that Daniels brought to the table. By the end of the first day, it was clear that the summit would not result in a consensus. The divide between traditional religious leaders and progressive thinkers was too vast, and many felt that the conversation had become too politicized. As the summit continued, a new and dangerous alliance began to form. Behind closed doors, several influential political and religious figures from conservative nations met in secret. They shared a common interest: stopping the reclamation movement from gaining further momentum. They had witnessed the growing protests and the power of the reclaimers in cities around the world, and they knew that this was no longer just a theological debate, it was a political threat. The alliance included President Enrique Salazar of Brazil, Prime Minister Petra Volkov of Hungary, and Cardinal Emilio Rojas, a powerful figure in the Catholic Church. The coalition's goal was clear: to discredit the reclamation movement and prevent the cultural shift from becoming permanent. Salazar, a populist leader known for his anti-progressive stance, was particularly vocal. This is not just about religion. This is about the fabric of our societies. We cannot allow these radicals to rewrite our history. Jesus is a symbol of Western civilization, and we will defend that image. Prime Minister Volkov agreed, but she saw the reclamation movement as a way to undermine the liberal democracies of Europe. The message is clear: if we allow this movement to gain traction, we will lose control of the narrative. We must preserve the Christian identity of Europe and resist the forces of political correctness. Together, they orchestrated a counter-narrative that painted the reclamation movement as divisive and dangerous. Using their influence in the media, they launched a global campaign to discredit Musk and Daniels, accusing them of attempting to hijack Christianity for political purposes. The media campaign was well-funded and highly effective, but the reclaimers had something the opposition could not replicate: grassroots support. The tipping point came on a cold winter evening in 2025. After weeks of escalating tension, a major protest in Rome turned violent. Protesters had gathered outside the Vatican to demand that the Church officially recognize the historical erasure of black and brown representations of Christ. What started as a peaceful demonstration quickly escalated when police clashed with protesters. Elon Musk was in Rome for a scheduled press conference, and the unfolding events were broadcast live. The world watched as clashes broke out between demonstrators and police. It was a chaotic and violent scene, but Musk saw an opportunity. He turned to his communications director and said, "This is what they want, the chaos. We have to change the narrative. This is about the truth, not violence." Musk, known for his ability to think outside the box, made a public declaration that would shock the world: "We will not be silenced. We will not back down. This is not a fight for power. It's a fight for truth. And the truth will always find a way to prevail." As the images of the violence played out on global news channels, public opinion began to shift. The world saw the protesters not as radical disruptors, but as people fighting for a just cause. People in the streets were chanting for justice, not chaos. And, for the first time, a growing majority of the global population began to agree with their message. The role of social media in the movement had been pivotal, but it was never more evident than in the aftermath of the Roman protests. The hashtag Black Jesus Matters trended worldwide, flooding social media platforms with powerful images, videos, and stories that humanized the reclamation movement in ways traditional media couldn't. Support for the movement surged, especially among young people, artists, and intellectuals. The emotional impact of seeing people around the world demand the truth about Jesus' identity reverberated across borders. It wasn't just about race, it was about truth, history, and justice. For many, the movement symbolized a new way of thinking about faith, one that didn't rely on the historical narratives that had been handed down to them, but instead encouraged people to engage with the roots of their beliefs. In the reclamation movement, powered by technology, was reshaping religious discourse in real time. Within the Catholic Church, the pressure was mounting. Pope Francis, who had initially spoken out in favor of reconciliation and dialogue, was now faced with an internal crisis. The Vatican was being bombarded with calls for reform from both progressive and conservative factions within the Church. Pope Francis made a historic decision. He called for a synod on racial justice and representation, an unprecedented gathering of bishops, theologians, and scholars to confront the issue of race within the Church. It was an attempt to reconcile the differences between those who believed in preserving traditional depictions of Christ and those advocating for a reimagining of Christ's image. The Vatican's decision to hold the synod was seen as a turning point. It was clear that the Church could no longer ignore the growing demands for reform. The world was watching. By the spring of 2025, the Reclamation movement had become a force to be reckoned with. It had sparked debates in academic circles, prompted governments to reconsider their policies, and led to significant changes in religious institutions across the globe. Yet, it was clear that this was only the beginning. Elon Musk and Dr. Daniels were no longer just figures of controversy. They had become symbols of a new era in global consciousness. They had united people across racial, religious, and cultural boundaries in pursuit of one shared truth: that the history of Jesus, and by extension, the history of the world, could no longer be viewed through the lens of colonialism and racial supremacy. Musk looked out over the skyline of New York City, reflecting on how far they had come. It was hard to believe that it all started with a single tweet, but now the movement had reached every corner of the world. The battle was far from over, but Musk knew one thing for certain: the world would never be the same again. The world was on the brink of something transformative. The Reclamation movement had spiraled into a global force that no one could ignore. What had started as a series of controversial claims about Jesus' racial identity had evolved into a fundamental challenge to the very structure of modern faith, society, and history. As the movement reached its zenith, people began to realize that the battle for the truth of the past was also a fight for the future. The Synod on Racial Justice and Representation convened in late 2025, and for the first time in history, the Catholic Church was prepared to address head-on the issue that had torn through its ranks: the racial identity of Jesus Christ. Pope Francis, having seen the writing on the wall, made a bold move. In a statement that would go down in history, the Pope declared that the Catholic Church would begin the process of rethinking the way Jesus was depicted in art and religious iconography, acknowledging the historical erasure of non-European depictions of Christ. The decision sent shockwaves through the Church, as well as through the broader global community. "We have failed to reflect the true diversity of Christ's followers," the Pope said. Jesus was a man of his time, and his time was one that spanned not just the Middle East but all of humanity. In that spirit, we will begin to reflect Christ as he truly was, a figure who belongs to all people. The Vatican's move was nothing short of revolutionary. It wasn't just a shift in religious imagery. It was a confrontation with centuries of colonial narratives that had shaped the way the world saw faith and power. And it was clear that this wasn't a change that could be undone. As the Church took its first steps toward transformation, the ripple effect was felt across the world. Other Christian denominations, previously reluctant to engage with the Reclamation movement, began to follow suit. Protestant churches, especially in the U.S. and Africa, began to reimagine their religious imagery. The once pervasive image of a white, European Christ began to fade into the background, replaced by more inclusive depictions: Jesus as Black, as Indigenous, as Latino, representing the true diversity of Christianity's global reach. Even in countries where the Church had been resistant, cracks began to show. In Russia, a new movement of religious scholars began to advocate for a more inclusive representation of Jesus, acknowledging the diversity of Christianity's origins and gaining support from younger generations who were more open to change. The backlash was inevitable, of course. Conservative factions in the Church, particularly in the U.S. and parts of Europe, rallied against the changes, claiming that it was an attack on the very essence of Christianity. They argued that the historical, traditional images of Christ were sacred and not to be altered for political reasons. However, the growing influence of global movements for racial justice, coupled with the moral weight of the Pope's statement, made their voices seem increasingly out of touch with the evolving times. The tide was turning, And the reclamation movement was no longer a fringe movement. It had become a central force in the global discussion about race, identity, and truth. For Elon Musk, the culmination of this global shift was bittersweet. He had always been a disruptor, a person who saw things differently and pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But this wasn't about technology or space exploration. This was about humanity, about reimagining the very way people thought about each other, about their histories, and about their faith. When Musk received the news that the Vatican had formally acknowledged the need for change, he felt a sense of vindication. The movement he had sparked was not only real, but it was shaping the future of religious and cultural discourse. Yet, he couldn't ignore the price that had been paid along the way. The movement had divided families, split communities, and caused significant political turmoil. There were people who had suffered, who had been hurt by the consequences of this ideological battle. But for Musk, the end result was clear. The truth had emerged from the ashes of conflict, and in that truth, there was hope for a more inclusive, honest, and just world. In an emotional public address, Musk told the world, "We have sparked a conversation that was long overdue. The truth was always there. It was always waiting to be recognized. We have uncovered it, and now we must live by it. A world that embraces all its people, regardless of color, origin, or background, is a world worth fighting for." For Dr. John Daniels, the end of the reclamation movement's primary struggle was a moment of personal reflection. He had seen it all: the initial wave of rejection, the violent protests, the media battles, the divisions within the church, and yet, as the movement reached its final, transformative phase, he couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Daniels had become a figurehead of the movement, speaking at summits, writing books, and advocating for a reimagining of history. But it was never about the fame or the recognition for him. It was about righting an injustice that had lasted for millennia. Standing before a crowd of thousands in Washington, D.C. in 2026, Daniels spoke with a calm yet resolute voice. "We have traveled a long road to get here. Along the way, we have faced resistance, hatred, and violence. But we have also seen solidarity, courage, and hope. The future is not about erasing the past. It's about confronting it, understanding it, and making sure that the mistakes of history never happen again." The crowd erupted in applause, and Daniels, though weary from years of struggle, allowed himself a small, knowing smile. They had won. Not just the battle over Jesus' racial identity, but the larger fight for justice, truth, and recognition for those who had been silenced. As time went on, the reclamation movement was no longer a singular event. It became a turning point in history. It was the moment when the world finally confronted its history of racial injustice, when the church acknowledged the erasure of marginalized voices, and when people, regardless of their faith, began to see the world through a lens of unity and inclusivity. Elon Musk's legacy was not just that of a billionaire innovator. It was that of a catalyst for change. The technologies and platforms he had built were now being used to help people from all walks of life explore their histories, tell their stories, and reshape their futures. Dr. Daniels, meanwhile, became a sought-after speaker and a thought leader in the field of racial justice, spiritual history, and reconciliation. He continued to advocate for the reconstruction of religious traditions, emphasizing the importance of diversity in faith communities around the world. The global movement for racial and religious justice that they had started would never be forgotten. It had forever altered the way the world viewed itself. In 2030, the world had changed. The image of Jesus was no longer a battleground. It had become a symbol of hope, of unity, and of the endless possibility for reconciliation. Communities that had been torn apart by centuries of division were now coming together, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. In cities across the world, art galleries showcased new depictions of Jesus, paintings, sculptures, and digital art that embraced the diversity of humanity. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples all began to celebrate a more inclusive vision of faith. People from different racial and religious backgrounds worked together to build a world that reflected the best of humanity. As the sun set over a new world, Elon Musk and Dr. Daniels stood together, looking out at the horizon. They had started a revolution of truth, justice, and healing. And in that moment, They knew that the work wasn't finished, but the world was finally on the right path. "We've only just begun," Musk said quietly, a glint of determination in his eyes. "Yes," Daniels replied, his voice filled with conviction. "But now, the future is ours to build." And so, the story of the reclamation movement ended, not with a battle, but with a promise. A promise of a world where truth, justice, and love would always prevail. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?